Everyone in New York's criminal underworld feared Alexander Whitmore, the mafia boss who never lost. But his enemies laughed behind his back about one thing: his blind wife. They called her his weakness, his burden, the fragile woman he carried like a stone around his neck. They were so certain she was helpless that not one of them thought to be afraid of her. That was the last mistake every single one of them ever made. If you've never seen a blind woman dismantle an empire from the shadows, stay with me. Subscribe, hit that like button, and drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. The rain came down hard on Fifth Avenue that Tuesday night, the kind of rain that made the city feel like it was trying to wash itself clean of something it couldn't name. It pooled in the cracks of the sidewalk outside Whitmore Tower and drummed against the floor-to-ceiling glass of the 42nd floor like it had a grudge. Alexander Whitmore stood at the window with a glass of bourbon he hadn't touched in 20 minutes. 44 years old, 6'2", the kind of man whose presence in a room made other men recalculate their exits. His face carried the particular stillness of someone who had learned long ago that expressions cost money, that a flinch, a smile at the wrong second, a flicker of hesitation across the jaw could be read by the right enemy and turned into a blade. He was watching the street below. Not nervously, just watching the way a man watches when he knows something is coming and hasn't yet decided how to meet it. Behind him, the penthouse was quiet. Expensive quiet. The kind that came with 12-foot ceilings and walls thick enough to swallow sound. There were flowers on the side table, white gardenias, fresh, changed every 2 days without being asked. A half-finished cup of tea on the coffee table, still faintly steaming. A novel left open on the armchair, spine cracked at page 212. He didn't need to turn around to know his wife was no longer in the room. Vivian moved like weather. She was there, and then she wasn't, and the only evidence she left behind was small and precise. The gardenia scent still hanging in the air, the slight indentation in the chair cushion, the teacup at exactly the right angle to her preferred sitting position. In 11 years of marriage, Alexander had never once heard her bump into anything. Never heard her knock over a glass or misjudge a door frame. Her blindness, to anyone watching from outside, looked like something she had simply decided not to be limited by. He had spent years marveling at it. He had also spent years not asking too many questions about it. That wasn't love, exactly. Or maybe it was the particular kind of love that develops between two people who each carry something they're not ready to explain. A mutual agreement written in silence. I won't press on yours if you don't press on mine. He heard her before he saw her. The soft, measured rhythm of her footsteps on the marble. The slight pause at the edge of the rug where the texture changed underfoot. She always paused there. One breath. Then she stepped onto the hardwood without breaking stride. You haven't moved in 40 minutes, Vivian said. She didn't phrase it as a question. I'm thinking. You think louder when something's wrong. She moved to the armchair, settled into it the same way she always did, right hand trailing the armrest first, body angling precisely before she sat. Her dark hair was loose. She was wearing the gray robe she'd had for 6 years, the one he'd offered twice to replace, and she'd quietly declined both times. Her eyes, open, were fixed somewhere past his shoulder in the direction of the window. They always looked like they were seeing something no one else could. He turned from the window finally. Carmine DeVito called me this afternoon. A pause. Thin as paper. What did Carmine want? To tell me his people saw Eddie Tran at the Marconi Club. Alexander set the bourbon down on the wet bar without drinking it, sitting at a table with Paolo Greco's nephew. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Her fingers, long and still in her lap, didn't move. How long ago? 3 days. And Carmine waited 3 days to tell you. Yes. She made a small sound that wasn't quite a laugh. Then the more interesting question isn't what Eddie Tran was doing at the Marconi Club. He looked at her. No, it isn't. Eddie Tran was Alexander's comptroller. Had been for 6 years. He knew the account structures, the shell companies, the layering systems that moved money from the docks through 4 different legitimate businesses before it came out clean on the other side. He knew timelines, amounts, names. If Eddie Tran was sitting across from someone connected to Paolo Greco, who had been trying to dismantle the Whitmore organization for 3 years from his position in Philadelphia, then what Alexander was looking at wasn't a controller with bad judgment. It was a pipe that ran straight from the center of his empire to his enemy's kitchen. "I need to talk to Richard," Alexander said. Richard Blackwood, his lieutenant for 9 years, the man who ran his street operations, managed the crew leaders, kept order in the boroughs, the man who, if something was moving inside the organization, would know about it, had to know about it. "Tomorrow morning." Vivian said nothing. He noticed that. "What?" "Nothing." "Vivian?" She turned her face toward him slightly, not looking at him. She couldn't look at him the way people meant when they said that, but orienting herself toward his voice with an attention that always felt more precise than sight. "Talk to Richard," she said. "Just listen carefully to what he doesn't say." He wanted to ask what that meant. He didn't, because in 11 years he had learned that her observations were never imprecise, and when he asked her to clarify them, the clarification was always something he already knew and had refused to see. He went to bed at midnight. He didn't sleep well. Vivian stayed in the armchair. She waited until his breathing changed, the long, slow cadence of sleep, the slight shift in the mattress she knew from thousands of nights beside him. Then she sat for another 10 minutes, not moving, listening to the rain against the glass and the building settling around her and the faint sound of traffic 42 floors below. Then she got up. She moved through the penthouse without touching the walls. The layout was in her body now, the same way language lives in the body, not thought about, not calculated, simply known. 14 steps to the kitchen, left turn, 9 steps to the study. She closed the study door behind her and stood for a moment in the silence. The room smelled like him, leather, cedar, and the particular dry smell of paper money that never quite washed out of a man's office, no matter how many times you cleaned it. She went to the desk and sat down. Her fingers found the edge of the laptop, found the power button, waited while it hummed to life. She didn't use the screen. She used the keyboard, navigating by memory and by the audio output running through a single earbud at a volume too low for anyone else to hear. She had been doing this for 3 years, keeping her own ledger, her own map of the organization's shape, its pressure points, the places where the structure strained under load. It was not the ledger Alexander thought she kept. His was organized by profit and loss, by territory and personnel. Hers was organized by behavior, by the small inconsistencies that built up over time in the speech patterns and movements of men who were doing something they shouldn't. A crew leader who started arriving to meetings with slightly more expensive shoes than his territory could reasonably produce. A lawyer who began billing 8 hours on days Alexander's calendar showed no meetings. A comptroller who started taking his lunch hours 6 blocks further from the office than he used to, in a neighborhood he had no professional reason to visit. She had known about Eddie Tran for 6 weeks. She had not told Alexander because she had not yet identified the vector, the point where the leak connected back to someone inside the inner circle, someone above Eddie Tran who had either recruited him or allowed the contact to happen. A comptroller didn't walk into a meeting with Paulo Greco's people on his own initiative. Someone cleared the path. She opened the file she'd been building, pulled the thread forward. Richard Blackwood had changed one habit 8 weeks ago. He had been taking a different route home from the Midtown office 3 nights a week. She knew because she'd asked the building's front desk attendant, a young man named Marcus who was sweet and chatty and completely unaware that he was providing intelligence, whether Mr. Blackwood had been coming in late on those nights. He had. 90 minutes later than usual, on average. The building was in the opposite direction from the Marconi Club, but it was also on the same subway line as the hotel in Murray Hill that Paulo Greco used when he came to New York. She closed the laptop. The problem with what she suspected was that she had no proof. Behavioral patterns weren't evidence. Alexander would not, could not, given the way he was built, given what Richard meant to him, act on suspicion without something solid. They had been together since they were in their 20s. Richard was the best man at their wedding. He had sat in hospital waiting rooms during each of the 2 times Alexander had been shot. In Alexander's cosmology, Richard Blackwood was foundational. You didn't dismantle the foundation of your own house based on lunch routes and subway lines. She needed something else. She sat for a long time in the dark study, listening to the rain ease off, thinking the way she had trained herself to think years before she ever met Alexander Whitmore. Not emotionally, not hopefully, but architecturally. If you wanted to understand how something would fall, you had to understand how it was built, where the load bore, where the stress accumulated, what it looked like from the outside when the interior had already begun to give way. She thought about what she knew. Then she thought about what she was going to do about it. Then she went to bed before Alexander woke up, moving through the dark of the bedroom with her hands at her sides, finding her side of the mattress by the particular way the floorboards felt under her bare feet, settling in beside him without waking him. He shifted slightly in his sleep and put his hand against her back. He always did that, even asleep, even when he didn't know he was doing it. She lay there in the dark, eyes open, and did not feel calm. The meeting with Richard happened at 9 the next morning in the Whitmore organization's legitimate front, a commercial real estate firm on Park Avenue that occupied the entire 14th floor of a building Alexander partly owned. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows and a long glass table and people who worked on the floors above and below who believed completely that the men who met there every week were discussing property acquisitions in the Bronx and Brooklyn. Richard Blackwood was already there when Alexander arrived. He was 51, broad-shouldered, with a close-cropped beard going gray at the edges and the kind of careful, measured energy that Alexander had always read as competence. He had the gift of presence without aggression, the ability to sit in a room and make other people feel managed without quite knowing why. He stood when Alexander entered. Old habit, not servility, just the specific choreography of respect that ran between them, coded and automatic. "You look like you slept like hell," Richard said. "I did." Alexander sat down across from him rather than at the head of the table, a choice Richard noticed and didn't comment on. "We have a problem with Eddie Tran." Richard's face moved in the right direction. Concern, tightening around the eyes, the forward lean of a man taking information seriously. "What kind of problem?" "Carmine DeVito's people saw him at the Marconi Club with someone from Paulo Greco's camp." Jesus. Richard sat back, exhaled. How solid is Carmine's source? Solid enough that he bothered to call me. When? 3 days ago. Carmine sat on it 3 days before he made the call. Something moved across Richard's face then. Something brief and fine-grained, like a shadow passing under ice. Alexander caught it, stored it, kept his own face neutral. 3 days, Richard repeated. That's a problem. Who does Eddie know over there? I didn't think he had any exposure to Greco's people. He shouldn't. Right. Richard turned his glass of water on the table. Once. A thinking habit. Okay. I'll have someone put eyes on him today, quietly. See who else he's been talking to, how long this has been going on. I want to know by tomorrow morning. You'll have it. Richard looked up. You think it's more than just Eddie? I think I don't know yet. Alexander held eye contact for a moment. Do you? Richard met it without flinching. I think Eddie's a smart guy who just made the dumbest decision of his life. But yeah, smart guys like that don't walk into rooms with Greco's people without someone pointing them through the door. Alexander said nothing. I'll find out who pointed him, Richard said. There was a particular kind of conversation that happened between two men who had known each other long enough. The one that existed entirely in what wasn't said. What Richard had just told him, without saying it, was that he already had a theory. And what Alexander had just told Richard, without saying it, was that he was listening very carefully to everything except the words. He thought about Vivian in the armchair last night. Listen to what he doesn't say. What Richard didn't say was anything about the route home, the late nights, the Murray Hill Hotel on the same line as Greco's preferred location. Alexander shook Richard's hand at the door, firm, normal, gave nothing away. In the elevator going down, he stood with his hands in his coat pockets and felt something cold settle in his chest. Not panic, not grief, something older and uglier than either. The specific feeling of a man who is beginning to understand that the ground he's been standing on has been hollow for some time. He was still feeling it when he walked through the front door of the penthouse at 11 and found Vivian sitting in the kitchen, both hands wrapped around a coffee mug, her head slightly tilted the way it went when she was listening to something the rest of the room couldn't hear. How did it go? She asked. He stood in the doorway for a moment. He offered to put eyes on Eddie, said he'd find out who pointed him to Greco's people. Vivian. He came further into the kitchen, sat down across from her. What do you know? She turned the mug slowly between her palms. I know that 8 weeks ago, Richard started leaving the office late 3 nights a week. I know that the nights he stays late are Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. I know that your meetings with him are Mondays and Fridays. She paused. I know that Paolo Greco prefers the Meridian Hotel in Murray Hill when he's in the city, and that the Meridian is accessible by the same subway line as your Park Avenue office. The kitchen was very quiet. How long have you known this? Alexander said. Long enough. Why didn't you tell me? She set the mug down. Her expression was not apologetic. It was something more complicated than that. The look of someone who has done the difficult arithmetic and arrived at a number they wish were different. Because I didn't have proof, and because you wouldn't have believed it without proof. Not about Richard. He wanted to argue with that. He found he couldn't, which was its own kind of proof. There's something else, Vivian said. Her voice was level, too level. The tone she used when she was managing how much weight she put on a sentence. 3 weeks ago, I asked Marcus at the front desk whether anyone had called asking about your schedule, your personal schedule, which building you'd be in, which days. He felt the cold thing in his chest sharpen. What did he say? He said yes. Someone had called twice, asked about your Tuesday afternoon departures, specifically. She paused. He thought it was a journalist. He told them which garage you use. Alexander was very still. The brake line on your car was inspected 2 weeks ago, Vivian said. I asked your mechanic to do it. I told him I'd heard a noise. He stared at her. There was a small cut, she said, not deep enough to fail immediately, deep enough to fail eventually, under the right conditions. On a highway, for example, at speed. The silence stretched between them. Alexander sat with it. Let it sit. The specific horror of understanding that something had been moving toward him in the dark for weeks, and that the only reason it hadn't arrived was the woman sitting across from him, who he had spent 11 years trying to protect. Vivienne, he started. Don't, she said quietly. Not harshly, just firmly. Not right now. He looked at his wife really looked at her, the way you look at something when you realize you haven't been seeing it clearly, and understood, maybe for the first time, that he had been operating on a fundamental misreading of the terms of their marriage. He had believed he was her protection. He was beginning to understand he had the equation backward. What do we do? He said. Vivienne picked up her coffee mug again. Her face was composed, precise, unreadable in the way it sometimes went. The way that had always reminded him, vaguely, of someone who had learned to make their feelings load-bearing rather than visible. We wait, she said, and we let Richard believe he's still ahead of us. She paused. But Alexander, there's something I need to tell you, something I should have told you a long time ago. She stopped. From somewhere below on the street, a car horn sounded. Once, sharp, then nothing. What is it? He said. She held the mug between both hands, and for the first time in 11 years of marriage, he saw something in his wife's face that he had never seen before. Not fear exactly. Something more unsettling than fear. The expression of someone standing at the edge of a decision they had delayed for years, knowing that once they stepped off, they could not step back. Before I met you, Vivian said slowly, I wasn't who I told you I was. He waited. She opened her mouth to continue, and then the phone on the kitchen counter lit up. Alexander's personal line, the one only 4 people in the world had the number for. One of them was Richard Blackwood. The name on the screen confirmed it. Alexander looked at it, then looked at his wife. Answer it, Vivian said. Her voice had gone very quiet and very flat. And listen to what he says. She already knew something. He could hear it in the way she'd stopped mid-sentence, the way her hands had gone still on the mug. Whatever she had been about to tell him, whatever truth had been building in her chest for 11 years, it was going to have to wait. He picked up the phone. Richard. Alex? Richard's voice was tight in a way Alexander had never heard before. Controlled tight, the way a man's voice goes when he's running a script he rehearsed. I need you to listen to me carefully. Something's happened. It's Vivian. She was in the elevator downstairs 30 minutes ago, and Alexander turned to look at his wife sitting 3 feet away from him, both hands around a coffee mug, very much present, very much not wherever Richard was describing. His blood went cold. She's been taken, Alex, Richard said. I'm sorry. I couldn't stop it. Alexander said nothing for 3 full seconds. He kept his eyes on Vivian. She was watching him, not watching him, but oriented toward him in that precise, attentive way, reading his silence, reading his breathing, reading whatever signal his body was sending across the space between them. He watched her face change as she understood what she was hearing. Not fear. Something harder than fear. Something that looked, for just a moment, terrifyingly like recognition. I'll be there in 20 minutes, Alexander said, and ended the call. He stood in the kitchen with the phone in his hand and looked at his wife, who was not in an elevator, who had not been taken, and who was looking back at him with an expression that told him, without a single word, that whatever she had been about to say before the phone rang was no longer a conversation that could wait. Tell me, he said, right now, all of it. Vivian set the mug down on the counter. The sound it made was small and precise. No rattle, no slide. She placed it exactly where it had been before, with the handle at the same angle, and then she folded her hands in her lap and said nothing for a moment. Alexander was still standing. He hadn't moved since he ended the call. The phone was still in his right hand, hanging at his side like something he'd forgotten he was holding. Outside, the city kept going. Traffic noise, a siren somewhere in the middle distance. The ambient grind of 12 million people conducting their lives below the 42nd floor. None of it touched the kitchen. Sit down, Vivian said. I don't want to sit down. Alexander. Her voice was quiet. Not soft. There was a difference. Soft was yielding. This was the tone of a woman who had decided something and was not going to decide it twice. Sit down. He sat. He put the phone on the table between them face down and pressed both palms flat against the surface and looked at his wife. 11 years. He had memorized her face the way you memorize a map of somewhere you live. Not consciously, not with effort, but through accumulated time until every line of it was navigation. He thought he knew every expression she had. He was looking at one he had never seen before, and it was rearranging something behind his sternum. Richard just told me you were taken, he said. You're sitting in front of me. I know. Which means either Richard is testing me, or Richard made that call to get me out of this building. The second one, she said. He wants you isolated. He wants you reacting instead of thinking. She paused. It's what you do when you want to control someone. You give them a crisis that doesn't exist, so they're too busy running toward it to notice the real move. The real move being what? She was quiet for a beat, 2 beats. He could see her organizing something internally, the slight tension across her collarbone, the way her chin dropped just slightly when she was choosing how to begin something difficult. My name before I married you, she said, was not Vivian Caldwell. He kept his hands flat on the table. Caldwell was my mother's maiden name. I took it because I needed something that had no history attached to it, something clean. She paused. The name I used before that, the name people in certain circles knew, was Lily. They called me the Black Lily. He had heard that name. Once, years ago, at a meeting he wasn't supposed to remember clearly, spoken by a man from Chicago who went pale when someone brought it up, the way men go pale when they hear the name of something they hoped had stopped existing. An assassin. The best one in the country, according to people who kept track of such things, which meant people in his world. A woman, which was unusual enough that it became part of the legend, operated alone, never missed, disappeared from the underworld approximately 12 years ago under circumstances nobody had been able to fully account for. He sat with that information for a moment. Say something, Vivian said. I'm thinking. You're deciding whether to be angry. I'm past angry. He looked at her directly. How long did you know this would come up? I knew it was coming when you told me about Eddie Tran. She turned her face toward the window, not looking at it, just orienting away from him slightly, the way she did when she was being more honest than comfortable. Someone in your organization identified me 6 months ago. I didn't know who at first. Then the patterns started building. The way certain people around you began behaving differently in my presence. More careful, like they'd been told something. Richard. I think so, yes. He knew who you were. He found out. I don't know how. Someone from the old network, probably. There are people who keep those files. Her jaw tightened slightly. The break line wasn't about you, Alexander. It was about me. He wanted you dead so that I'd be unprotected, isolated. A woman alone with no husband and no cover story. The full architecture of it landed on him then, all at once. Not like a shock, but like a weight. The slow, compressive kind that builds until you feel it in the spine. Richard had known. For months, Richard had known that Alexander's blind wife was the Black Lily, the most dangerous assassin the underworld had produced in a generation, and he had spent those months not running from her but maneuvering around her, getting her isolated, getting her exposed, which meant Richard wasn't afraid of her, which meant Richard had something he thought was enough to neutralize her. He has people coming, Alexander said. It wasn't a question. He has people here, Vivian said. In the building. I heard them in the lobby when Marcus came up to drop off the mail this morning. 2 men. They weren't residents and they weren't contractors, and they asked which floor the Whitmore penthouse was on. She paused. Marcus didn't tell them, but they already knew. Alexander stood up. The chair scraped back and he was at the window in 4 steps, not looking out but standing to the side of the glass, angling for sightlines below without being visible from street level. An old habit, one he'd developed so long ago it felt like instinct. We need to move, he said. Not yet. He turned. Vivian, if we move now, Richard knows we know. We lose the only advantage we have. She stood up from the kitchen table, and the way she moved, efficient, economical, her hands coming away from the chair back with a precision that was suddenly jarring in context, made something in Alexander's chest tighten. He had watched her move through rooms for 11 years and told himself it was grace. He was recategorizing it now, rapidly and without pleasure. I need you to call Richard back. And say what? Tell him you're on your way, that you're scared, that you need him to find her. Her voice was completely flat. Give him what he wants to hear. You want me to perform for him. I want you to buy us 40 minutes. She was already moving toward the hallway. Can you do that? He watched her go. She moved through the kitchen doorway without touching the frame, turned left into the hallway, disappeared toward the study. He stood there for a second with his hands at his sides and his jaw tight, and his whole understanding of the last 11 years undergoing a revision so significant it felt structural. Then he picked up the phone. Richard answered on the second ring. Alex, where is she? He put everything he had into it, the ragged edge, the barely controlled fear of a man who'd just been told his wife was taken. It wasn't entirely performance. That was the part that surprised him. Richard, where the hell is she? What happened? She's okay. Richard's voice had shifted into something that sounded like reassurance and landed like management. She's okay. She's safe. Nobody's hurt her. I need you to come to me. I need you away from the building. Do you understand? The people who took her, they have someone watching your floor. What people? Who took her? Why would anyone? I'll explain everything when you get here. But Alex, you need to listen to me right now. Don't call the elevator. Take the stairs to the parking garage and go out through the service exit on 43rd. My car's there. Driver named Costa. He'll bring you to me. The service exit on 43rd. Away from the doorman. Away from the cameras on the main entrance. Costa, a driver Alexander had never heard of, in a car he couldn't verify. Okay, Alexander said. His voice cracked precisely on the right syllable. Okay, I'm coming. He ended the call. He stood for a moment in the kitchen silence. Then he went to find his wife. She was in the study. The laptop was open and she was at it with both hands moving across the keyboard with a speed and precision that stripped away any remaining architecture of the fiction he'd been living in. This wasn't a woman navigating by memory and careful habit. This was someone who had been doing this, exactly this, for years. Building something, maintaining something, a system he had never been shown. I called him, Alexander said. He wants me to use the service exit. Driver named Costa. Costa works for Paolo Greco. He's been in the city for 3 weeks. She didn't look up from the keyboard. Couldn't look up. But her attention was entirely on what she was doing, the focused, airless concentration of someone running calculations. Richard told Greco's people you'd be coming down. They'll take you into the garage. Then we don't go to the garage. You don't go to the garage, she said. I need to go somewhere else. He felt the cold thing sharpen again. Vivian, I need to make a call, and I need to do it before Richard figures out you're not moving. She pulled out a phone he had never seen before. Not a regular phone. This was smaller, older, prepaid by the look of it, the kind that existed specifically because it left nothing. She held it for a moment with her thumb against the screen. This will take 5 minutes. You need to go to the bedroom, take the firearm from the back of the closet safe, and put it somewhere you can get to it quickly. I know where my weapons are. The one I'm talking about isn't yours. She paused. It's mine. Left side of the closet, behind the winter coats, there's a seam in the drywall about 6 inches above the baseboard. Press it. She finally turned her face toward him. I should have told you it was there. I'm telling you now. He left the study without answering because there was nothing to say and they both knew it. The bedroom closet was large and ordered, his side dark suits and dress shirts, her side softer fabrics, the winter coats she kept even though New York winters no longer required the heavy ones. He went to the left side and crouched at the baseboard and found the seam with his fingers, a faint line in the drywall barely wider than a thumbnail. He pressed it. The panel gave inward with a dry click. Behind it, a space roughly the size of a shoebox, the interior lined with a material that absorbed radar signals and suppressed the kind of electromagnetic signature that professional-grade detection equipment would otherwise catch. He had seen compartments like this before. He had seen them in the homes of men who lived very specific kinds of lives. Inside, a firearm he didn't recognize by model, but recognized by category. Compact, suppressor-ready, chamber already loaded. A folded piece of paper. A second prepaid phone, this one dead, battery removed and stored separately. And a photograph. He picked up the photograph. It was taken outdoors, somewhere that looked like Eastern Europe from the gray, flat quality of the light. In it stood a woman he recognized and didn't recognize at the same time. Vivian's bone structure, Vivian's posture, but everything else was different. Shorter hair, a different quality in the stance, loose, weight forward, the specific readiness of someone who fought from instinct rather than plan. She was looking directly at the camera, and her expression was not the expression of his wife. It was the expression of someone who had not yet decided to become someone else. She was younger, 26, maybe 27, before the blindness, before him. He stood there for longer than he should have. Then he folded the photograph, put it in his jacket pocket, took the weapon, and went back to the study. Vivian was off the phone. She was standing now, and she had changed. He didn't know when, hadn't heard her move to the bedroom, which should have been impossible given that he'd just been in the bedroom. But her robe was gone, and she was in dark clothes, fitted, nothing loose enough to catch on anything. Her hair was pulled back. In her right hand, she held the small prepaid phone, and in her left, she held nothing, but her left hand was slightly different from how it usually hung. The fingers slightly curved, the weight distributed the way weight distributes in a hand that's done specific things for a very long time. "Who did you call?" he said. "Someone who owes me." She paused. "He's going to create a problem in the lobby for the next 20 minutes. Not dangerous, just loud and confusing and difficult to manage quickly. It gives us a window." "A window for what?" "Richard made the call from his real phone. I had someone trace it." She turned toward him. "He's not at his apartment. He's at a location in Red Hook, a warehouse your organization has used for cold storage for the last 4 years. He's there with at least 8 people, and he's waiting." "Waiting for me to walk into the garage?" "Yes." A pause. "He's also not alone in terms of organization. Greco has 12 people in the city right now. Richard told them he could deliver you tonight, packaged and helpless. Her voice stayed level. The flatness of it was harder to listen to than anger would have been. He's been planning this for 5 months. He's been moving pieces for 5 months, and he sat across from you yesterday morning and told you he'd find out who pointed Eddie Tran toward Greco's people. The fury came then. Finally, fully, not the cold thing anymore, but something hot and jagged that he had to work to keep out of his face. 9 years of Richard Blackwood at the center of his organization, at his table, at his back. Best man at his wedding, which meant Richard had stood 6 feet from Vivian on the best day of Alexander's adult life and known even then, or learned later and said nothing, which was its own kind of answer to who Richard Blackwood actually was underneath the version Alexander had built in his mind. "Tell me what you need from me," Alexander said. His voice was controlled, barely. Something shifted in her expression. A small thing. She had been waiting for something in him to catch up to something in her, and whatever she'd been waiting for had just arrived. "I need you to trust me," she said, "not the way you've been trusting me. Not like I'm something you're protecting." She paused. "Like a partner." The word landed between them. He felt the full weight of what it meant for her to say it, what it cost, given everything she'd been carrying alone, what it meant that she was asking now, in this moment, when the building had men in the lobby and Richard was in Red Hook with 8 bodies and a plan. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me what we're doing." She told him. It took 11 minutes. She laid it out with the same architectural precision she brought to everything, not in bullet points, not in lists, but in sequence, each piece fitted to the next, the logic of it interlocking the way good structure always interlocks. She told him about the 3 contacts she'd maintained without his knowledge. She told him about the financial thread she'd pulled from Eddie Tran's behavior that led back not just to Greco, but to a third party. A name that made Alexander's hands still. A man named Warren Stahl, who ran private security contracts on the East Coast, and who had been quietly buying influence inside Alexander's organization for 2 years, using Richard as the vehicle. Richard wasn't just a traitor. Richard was a paid instrument. Which meant the real problem wasn't Richard. The real problem was Stahl. "Stahl wants the organization's infrastructure," Vivian said. "Not the money, not the territory. The architecture, the shell companies, the laundering system, the legal cover. He wants to absorb it into his operation and run it as a security-adjacent enterprise. Clean on the surface. He's been building toward this for 3 years. And Richard sold him access. Richard sold him everything." She paused. "Including me. Stahl identified me 8 months ago. He told Richard who I was. That was the deal. Richard gives Stahl the organization. Stahl neutralizes me so I can't interfere. They tried to neutralize you by cutting a brake line. That was the first attempt." Her voice didn't waver. "Tonight's the second." He stood with that, processed it. "What's tonight's attempt?" "When you don't show up at the garage, Richard will call Stahl. Stahl will send people here." She turned her face slightly toward the window, that precise listening orientation. "They're probably already in the building. The 2 men in the lobby were Stahl's, not Greco's. Richard used both organizations to double the coverage." The lobby. The 20-minute window Vivian had just bought them. "How long do we have?" he said. 14 minutes now." He looked at his wife. This woman he had spent 11 years constructing a particular story about. Fragile, dependent, the one soft thing in a hard life. The person he came home to because she existed outside the violence. He had never asked himself whether the story was accurate. He had needed it to be accurate. He had needed her to be the proof that he was something more than what he did for a living. That some part of him existed in clean air. That story was gone. He grieved it for exactly 4 seconds, which was all the time it deserved. What replaced it was something he didn't have a word for yet. Something that had more structural integrity than the story had ever had. "The Red Hook warehouse," he said. "You want to go there?" "Richard thinks he's waiting for you." She reached into the inside pocket of the dark jacket and produced what looked like a slim leather case, opened it with her fingers, read the contents by touch with a speed that was almost imperceptible. "I want Richard to be right about that. You want to walk into a warehouse with 8 armed men." I want to walk into a warehouse where the men are expecting someone who doesn't know they're coming. She closed the case. There's a difference. Vivian. He moved closer to her, closed the distance across the study floor in a way he hadn't intended to, stopped when he was near enough to see the detail of her face. She didn't step back. She turned toward him, reading him by proximity, by the heat and sound of him. I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me straight. Ask it. The accident. The one that took your sight. Was it... He stopped. Reformed. Was it connected to this? The pause before she answered was the longest of the conversation. It was the last job I took, she said. There was a man who'd been contracted to stop me from completing it. He didn't stop me. She paused. But he got close enough. She kept her face toward him, and her expression was the one he'd seen for the first time in the kitchen an hour ago, the one that had no name yet. I retired after that because I thought I was done. I thought I wanted to be done. A pause. Then I met you, and done became easier to believe. He reached out and put his hand against the side of her face. She let him. She turned into it slightly, the small, involuntary tilt that she'd done since the first time he'd touched her, 11 years ago, which he had always read as trust and was now reading as something larger and more complicated than that word had room for. I'm not going to tell you to be careful, he said. Good. I'm going to tell you I'm with you. Something moved across her face. Not surprise exactly. More like the settling of something that had been held in suspension. She reached up and put her hand over his. Her fingers were cold. Then we need to go, she said. Right now. They moved through the penthouse together, Alexander collecting the firearm from the closet, the backup from the kitchen drawer he thought she didn't know about. His phone. Vivian moved with a speed and quietness that he was no longer misreading. She stopped at the front door, right hand on the handle, head tilted in that listening way. The stairwell on the left, she said quietly. Not the main stairs. Why the left? Because the man they put on our floor is standing near the main stairs. I can hear him breathing. She paused. He breathes through his mouth. He's been there for 40 minutes. He's bored, and he's not paying full attention. Alexander had no response to that. He followed her through the door, into the corridor, and they moved together toward the left stairwell in the specific silence of two people who had just made a decision from which there was no reasonable exit, and both of them knew it, and neither of them said so, because there was nothing left to say that the next hour wouldn't say for them. The stairwell door closed behind them without a sound. 3 floors down, Alexander's phone vibrated. He checked it without slowing. A text from Richard, 4 words. Where are you, Alex? He showed it to Vivian without thinking, then remembered and felt the specific idiocy of the gesture, the 11-year habit running ahead of the new information. But Vivian had already heard the buzz, already tilted her head. What does it say? He read it to her. She didn't answer for 3 flights of stairs, then, don't respond. He'll know something's wrong. He already knows something's wrong. Her voice was steady, her footfalls even, each landing absorbed precisely. He's been knowing something's wrong since you didn't walk into the garage. He's asking because he's scared. She paused on a landing. Let that land. Richard Blackwood has never been afraid of you, Alexander. In 9 years, he's sat across from you and managed you and run parallel operations under your roof, and he has never once been afraid of you. She started moving again. He's afraid now because he knows I'm still in that building. He's been told what I am, and it still didn't prepare him for the reality of it. And what is the reality of it? She pushed open the door at the bottom of the stairwell. The service corridor beyond was lit with fluorescence, smelled of cleaning products and concrete. She stepped through and stopped, orienting, reading the air. The reality, she said, is that he kidnapped the wrong woman. She said it quietly, without theater. The way you state a fact about weather or distance, and something about the flatness of it, the total absence of performance in it, made Alexander Whitmore, who had spent 20 years in the most violent business in the city and had not been genuinely frightened by another human being in a very long time, feel something cold move through him. Not at her. Not exactly. but adjacent to her. The recognition of something that had been in his house, at his table, in his bed for 11 years, and that he was only now beginning to understand the dimensions of. They moved through the service corridor. At the end, a door to the loading dock behind the building. Beyond that, the back street, the city, the night. And somewhere in Red Hook, a warehouse where Richard Blackwood was waiting for a frightened man in a car he'd arranged. What was coming instead was going to be the last thing Richard Blackwood ever incorrectly anticipated. Vivian pushed open the loading dock door, and the cold air of the city came in hard and immediate, and she stepped into it without hesitation, and Alexander followed her into the dark. And behind them, from somewhere up in the building, a phone began to ring in an empty kitchen, and rang and received no answer, and the man who was calling it stood in a Red Hook warehouse with 8 armed men around him, and a plan he was only now beginning to understand had already come apart. The loading dock gave onto a narrow service alley that ran between the back of Whitmore Tower and the utility wall of the building behind it. The alley smelled of wet concrete and exhaust, and the particular sourness of a city that never fully slept. Sodium lights overhead threw everything in amber and shadow. A delivery truck was parked halfway down, engine off, no driver visible. Vivian stopped 2 steps into the alley, her head tilted. Alexander stopped with her, saying nothing, watching her read whatever she was reading from the air and the sound and the smell of the space around them. He had done this before, waited while she oriented, but he was doing it differently now. He was watching the way a man watches a thing he has stopped taking for granted. "The truck," she said quietly. "What about it?" "Someone's in the cab, passenger side. They've been there long enough that the window fogged from breath." She didn't move toward it or away from it. "They're not Stahl's people. Wrong posture, too relaxed. Stahl runs military-adjacent contractors. They don't slouch. Could be a delivery driver sleeping." "Could be." She paused. "It's not." He trusted that the way he'd learned to trust things he couldn't verify himself. They moved left, away from the truck, toward the alley's far end. Behind them, nothing moved. The truck stayed where it was. They came out onto 43rd heading west, into foot traffic thin enough at this hour that 2 people moving quickly didn't register. Alexander had his jacket collar up and his hands in his pockets, and he walked like a man who owned the sidewalk, which he'd been doing since he was 22, and it had become involuntary. Vivienne walked slightly behind him and 1 step to the left, close enough that she could orient by the sound and warmth of him, and he didn't slow down for her because she'd made it clear with her body, with the angle of her shoulders, with every micro-adjustment of her position, that slowing down was not something she required. He flagged a cab at the corner of 43rd and 10th. They got in. He gave an address 6 blocks from the Red Hook warehouse. Not the warehouse itself, not a location Richard could have anticipated or covered. In the back seat, the city moved past the windows and neither of them spoke for a while. The cab driver had the radio on low, some late-night talk program, a man's voice going through sports statistics with the flat dedication of someone filling silence for money. "The 3rd contact," Alexander said. "The one you called from the study. Who is it?" "His name is Dario Messina. He did 3 years in federal detention for refusing to testify about an operation I was running when he was peripherally involved. He never gave my name." She paused. "I've been servicing that debt since 2014. "How?" "Information, mostly, occasionally access." She said it the way you say things that are too large for the words available, and you know it, and you say them anyway. He's the one who created the disturbance in the lobby. "And the people he reached, they're in Red Hook now." "2 of them. They went ahead." She kept her hands in her lap, very still. "I need you to understand something before we get there." "Tell me." "Richard is going to try to use our history against you, yours with him. He knows that you—" She stopped, reformulated. "He's watched you for 9 years and he knows where your hesitations live. He'll try to make you doubt what you know." She turned her face toward him slightly. "Don't let him." "I won't." "Alexander." Her voice dropped. Not softer, more concentrated, the way heat concentrates. "I mean it. The moment you feel yourself starting to hear him, I need you to remember the brake line." He didn't answer, but he put his hand briefly over hers on the seat, and she turned her hand under his and let him hold it for the 3 minutes it took to reach their stop. And then she took her hand back, and they got out of the cab and moved toward the waterfront, and neither of them mentioned it again. Red Hook at this hour was the sound of water against pilings, and the smell of salt and industrial diesel, and the distant machinery of the port that never fully stopped. The streets were wide and badly lit and mostly empty. The warehouses stood in rows, large and indifferent, their loading doors shut, their exteriors lit only by the perimeter lights that companies installed not for safety, but for the appearance of it. Dario Messina's 2 people were waiting in a parked car on the access road east of the warehouse. Alexander had never met them. He assessed them quickly and thoroughly in the 30 seconds he had. Mid-30s, Eastern European by the bone structure. The particular economy of movement that came from training rather than experience. They were professionals. Not the kind he used, but the kind he recognized. One of them, a woman with close-cropped dark hair and a scar along her left jawline, looked at Vivian and gave a brief nod that contained more communication than most people managed in full sentences. Vivian nodded back. "Positions?" Vivian said. 8 confirmed inside, the woman said. Her accent was slight, controlled. 2 on the south door, 1 on the roofline, 5 interior. Blackwood is in the back office. Northeast corner, ground floor. Stalls people or Grecos? Mix. 4 Greco, 4 stall. They're not comfortable with each other. There's been friction. A pause. The one on the roof left his position 12 minutes ago. Hasn't come back. Vivian absorbed this. The interior 5, how are they staged? 2 near the main floor, 3 closer to the office. It looks like they're expecting 1 person coming through the south door. The coverage is front-weighted. Because Richard told them 1 person was coming, Vivian turned her face slightly toward Alexander. He's still running on the assumption that you don't know. Alexander looked at the warehouse. From here, it was just a long, dark building with a few lights in the upper windows, and the particular stillness of a place where people were waiting with guns. He had been in situations like this before. Warehouses, basements, parking structures, the whole geography of the violent life he'd built and sustained. But he had always come to them from a position of organizational strength. He had always had numbers. Tonight, he had himself, his wife, and 2 people he'd known for 4 minutes. "What's the plan?" he said to Vivian. "The south door is where they're watching. We don't use the south door." She was quiet for a moment, head slightly tilted, running something through her mind with the focused internal velocity he was coming to recognize. There's a ventilation access on the north face. Warehouses this age have them low on the wall, about 4 feet up. Large enough. She paused. "I go in first." "No." "Alexander, I go in first." She turned toward him fully. "You go in first and they hear you before you're positioned, we lose everything. I go in and they hear nothing until I want them to." Her voice was not unkind. It was the voice of someone stating an operational fact that happened to be painful. "You know I'm right." He knew she was right. He stood there knowing it and hating it for about 5 seconds. And then he let it go because this was the partnership she'd asked him for on the 42nd floor, and he'd said yes to it, and saying yes meant this. "The moment anything changes," he said, "you'll know." She turned to the woman from Messina. "North face, I need 20 seconds after you take the roof position." "We don't have roof." "The one who left his position." Vivian said it quietly. "He's behind the east dumpster. He's been there since you arrived." A beat. "He's not watching the warehouse. He's watching this car." Silence. "They know we're here," Alexander said. Flat, cold. "They know someone's here. They don't know who." Vivian was already moving, which means we have approximately 4 minutes before whoever he reports to makes a decision. Everything happened with the specific compressed urgency of a situation that has run out of the luxury of deliberation. The woman from Messina moved toward the east end of the building without being told. Her partner went low and fast toward the man behind the dumpster, and Alexander didn't watch what happened there because there wasn't time. And 30 seconds later, there was no further sound from that direction, and Vivian was already at the north face of the warehouse, with her hand against the brick reading the surface the way a reader reads a page. She found the ventilation access in the dark by touch alone. She went through it in a way that shouldn't have been physically possible for someone operating without sight. And then she was inside, and the night was just the dock sound and the water, and Alexander standing at the north wall with his weapon in his hand, and his wife somewhere in the black interior of a building full of armed men. He counted seconds, got to 60, and moved to the south door. The door opened inward. The two men positioned there registered him in the half-second before he registered the third man he hadn't expected. Positioned not at the door but 12 feet inside, in a shadow line the exterior intelligence hadn't caught, standing with a short-barreled weapon already partially raised. The third man went down before Alexander could move. He went down without a sound, which was the part that lived with Alexander afterward. The total silence of it, the way the man simply ceased to be a problem between one breath and the next. Alexander didn't see how. He heard a movement in the dark above him, and to the left, a displacement of air, and then the man was down. The two at the door were still processing. Alexander didn't give them time to finish. The next 40 seconds were the specific, ugly, close-range work that he had been doing in various configurations since he was 26. And when it was over, he was breathing hard, and his left arm had taken a hit he was going to need to look at but couldn't look at yet. And two of Messina's people appeared through a side access he hadn't been told about, which meant the plan had layers he hadn't been given, and he filed that information for later. The main floor of the warehouse was high-ceilinged and smelled of old oil and rust. Pallets of stored product, legitimate, some dry goods supplier that had contracted storage space, lined the east wall. The light was low, sourced from work lights strung along the ceiling beams, casting pools and leaving long shadows between. Two men on the main floor. Alexander saw one of them. The other he found by the shift in weight on the concrete floor. A vibration. A sound below sound that he had developed the ability to perceive through 20 years of being in rooms where threat was directional. He moved fast and low across the floor and was into the next sequence before thought could catch up to action, which was what survival in close-range engagements actually required. Not strategy, not plan, but the total subordination of the conscious mind to the body's accumulated knowledge. When it settled, there were three men down on the main floor, and Alexander was against the northeast wall, breathing through his nose, arm bleeding through his jacket sleeve, 15 feet from the door to the back office. Through it, he could hear Richard Blackwood on the phone. He couldn't hear Vivian. The office door was steel-framed, industrial, the kind with a small wired glass window at eye level. Alexander moved to the edge of it and looked through. Richard was standing with his back partly toward the door, phone to his ear, speaking in a low, rapid voice. In the room with him were three men, the remaining stall contractors, by the look of them, hard-faced and positioned with the specific geometry of trained close protection. And seated in the room's single chair, wrists zip-tied to the armrests, was a man Alexander didn't immediately recognize. Then he did. Eddie Tran. Alive. Breathing. Beaten badly enough that his face was a map of damage, but alive. His head was down and his shoulders were moving with the shallow, rapid rhythm of someone maintaining consciousness through will alone. Alexander looked at this and recalculated everything very fast. Richard ended the call. He turned and looked directly at the door. Not at Alexander specifically, not yet, but with the particular anticipatory attention of a man waiting for something he'd planned. He spoke to one of the three men beside him without looking at him. "Bring him in." Alexander had three choices in the next 2 seconds, and he took none of them, because the fourth choice, the one that hadn't existed a second ago, announced itself in the form of a sound from inside the room. A very small sound. The precise click of a weight-bearing latch releasing under controlled pressure. One of the three men registered it, started to turn. Vivian came through the ceiling access panel like something that had been waiting in the architecture of the building itself, and the first of the three men went down before any of the others had completed the process of understanding what was happening, because understanding requires sequential thought, and she was already 3 moves past the beginning of the sequence before the beginning had fully registered. Alexander hit the door. The second man turned and she was already past him, inside his reach, which was where she wanted to be. Close range eliminated the advantages of size and vision and left only training and precision and the specific advantage of someone who had spent years learning to function in darkness. She moved through him the way water moves through a gap, finding the structural weakness and applying exactly the right force to exactly the right point, and he went down hard. The third man got his weapon up. Alexander shot it out of his hand, close range, careful angle. He wasn't trying to kill, not yet, not until he had answers, and his aim under pressure had always been one of the things he didn't have to think about. The man swore and grabbed his wrist, and Vivian was already past him, stopping in the center of the room with her weight forward and her breathing clean and her hands at her sides. And Richard Blackwood stood 6 feet away from her with his weapon drawn and aimed and his face doing something Alexander had never seen on it before. He was afraid. Not the managed, controlled acknowledgement of risk that all men in their business lived with. He was afraid the way an animal is afraid, the kind that moves from the oldest part of the brain, that doesn't dress itself up or explain itself. He was looking at Vivian, and he was genuinely, fully afraid. "Put it down, Richard," Alexander said from the doorway. Richard didn't. His weapon stayed up, aimed at Vivian's chest, and his hand was not entirely steady. "You brought her here," he said. "That was... Alex, you don't understand what you're standing next to." "I'm standing next to my wife." "You're standing next to the Black Lily." Richard's voice was fractured at the edges. "Do you know how many people she's killed? Do you have any idea? Put it down." "She'll kill me the second I do." "I won't," Vivian said. Her voice was completely level, the flatness of deep water. "I need you to answer questions. Dead men don't answer questions." She paused. "But Richard, if you fire that weapon, you won't be the one who faces consequences. He will." She tilted her head toward Eddie Tran in the chair. "I see an injection site on his left arm. Whatever you used on him. Stimulant to keep him conscious, I'd guess. It's been in his system too long. He needs medical attention." Another pause. "Which means I need you alive and cooperative in the next 10 minutes, not because I'm choosing to spare you, but because you're the only person in this room who knows the full protocol for what you dosed him with." Richard looked at Eddie. His jaw worked. The weapon didn't lower. "Warren Stahl," Alexander said. "Tell me about Stahl." Richard looked at him. Something changed in his face. Not relief, not the release of a man who decides to cooperate, but something worse. A resignation. The specific expression of a man who understands that the information he's been protecting has just become more dangerous to hold than to release. He lowered the weapon. He set it on the floor. "Stahl's not in Philadelphia," Richard said. "He was never the primary. I let you think Greco was the threat, because Greco is the obvious threat. He's loud, he's territorial. You've been watching him for 3 years. Richard looked at Alexander with something that might have been, underneath all the other things, an apology that would never be adequate. Stahl has been inside the organization for 4 years, not through me. I came in 18 months ago. Before me, he had someone else." The room was very quiet. "Who?" Alexander said. Richard's eyes went briefly, involuntarily, to the ceiling, not looking at anything, looking away from the weight of what he was about to say. "Diane Cho, your financial director for 6 years. He paused. "She died of a stroke 14 months ago. You remember?" "I remember." "She didn't have a stroke." Richard said it quietly. "Stahl had her removed when he'd taken everything he needed from her position. She was going to come to you. He found out." He swallowed. "He's very good at finding out." Alexander stood with this. The room stood with this. Eddie Tran's shallow breathing was the only sound. "If Stahl has been inside for 4 years," Vivian said, and her voice was controlled, so controlled, but Alexander could hear the thing underneath it. "Then he has the full account architecture. All of it." "Yes." "The shell companies." "Yes." "The legal layering, the property holdings under the subsidiary names." "Yes." Richard looked at her directly for the first time since she'd come through the ceiling. "All of it. He's had the complete structure for 8 months. He hasn't moved yet because he's been waiting for one more thing." "What thing?" Alexander said. Richard was quiet for 2 seconds. Then he said it. "He's been waiting to identify the Black Lily, to confirm who she was, and where she was, and what she had." A pause. Because the one thing he doesn't have, the one thing Diane Cho didn't have access to and your financial systems don't contain, is whatever she built independently, whatever she knows that isn't in your organization's records. He looked at Vivian. He doesn't just want the organization. He wants what's in her head, the network she maintained, the contacts, the methods. He paused. He believes she kept her own architecture, parallel to yours. And he wants it. The silence that followed was different from the silences before it. Heavier. More specific. Because Richard was right. She had built it. Over 11 years, quietly, systematically, the way she'd been trained to build redundant systems before she understood that her life would require one. She had maintained her own architecture, contacts, accounts, methods, intelligence, completely separate from Alexander's. The things she'd used tonight to reach Dario Messina, to identify Stahl's men in the lobby, to trace Richard's phone, to know about the ventilation access. The thing that had kept Alexander alive without his knowledge for years. Stahl knew it existed. He didn't have it, and he had moved every piece on the board to get it. He knew I was here before tonight, Vivian said. Not a question. 8 months, Richard said. He's known for 8 months. And you've been his instrument for 18. Richard said nothing. The silence was its own answer. Vivian turned toward Alexander. Her face was the controlled face, the unreadable one, but he could see the edges of it now. Could see the cost of the control, the way it was work rather than nature in this moment. She had built a life for 11 years on the premise that her disappearance from the underworld had been complete, that the Black Lily was a ghost that nobody was still actively searching for, that the life she'd made with Alexander was real and clean and protected by its own anonymity. Stahl had destroyed that premise 8 months ago, and she hadn't known. My contacts, she said quietly. If he's been watching me for 8 months. He's been watching who you call. Richard's voice was carefully neutral. The neutrality of a man who is past the point of managing the damage and has decided to simply give the information cleanly. He has a monitoring operation on all outgoing communications from the building, has had for 6 months. He paused. The call you made from the study tonight, the prepaid, he has that number. She was still. Dario Messina, she said. I don't know that name. The man I called tonight, if Stahl has that number, then he knows who you reached out to. Richard looked at the floor. Yes. She turned away from Richard. She turned toward the narrow, grimy window on the warehouse's north wall, turned toward it and stood there for a moment in the specific stillness that Alexander had once read as peace and now read as the stillness of a person absorbing a blow without externalizing it, the internal discipline of someone trained to keep their reactions below the line of visibility. Dario Messina, who was in the lobby of Whitmore Tower right now, creating a disturbance to buy them time. Who had given them this window? Who had 2 people here, in this building, who had helped them reach this room? Who Stahl's people now had a name and a number for? Call him, Alexander said. Tell him to move. She already had the prepaid in her hand, already dialing. She held it to her ear. It rang. It rang 6 times. It clicked to voicemail. Not Messina's voice, just a generic outgoing message, the kind that told you nothing about who owned the phone. She lowered it. The blood had drained from her face in a way Alexander had never seen before. She was not a woman who lost color easily. She was not a woman who showed fear in the skin. But the color was gone from her face, and her hand around the prepaid was very tight, and she was very still. Vivian, he said. She turned back toward the room. Her eyes were open and oriented toward nothing, and her face had gone beyond the controlled expression into something he didn't have a name for. The expression that lives on the other side of the controlled one, the one that only appears when control costs more than the person can afford. Stahl moved before we did, she said. Her voice was quiet and absolutely precise. He didn't wait to see what happened tonight. He moved when the monitoring system picked up my call. How long ago was that call? 40 minutes. 40 minutes. Dario Messina, who had been doing her a favor, who had walked into the lobby of Whitmore Tower to create a disturbance on her behalf, who had no idea he'd been identified before he arrived. The phone in her hand had 6 unanswered rings worth of information in it, and the information was this. Warren Stahl was not reacting to their movements tonight. He had been ahead of them the entire time. The plan she had built, the architecture of the evening, the contacts, the timing, the intelligence she'd trusted, had been observed, catalogued, and preempted by a man who had 8 months of preparation and resources she had not fully accounted for, and who had used those 8 months not to move against her directly, but to map every thread she might pull when she finally decided to pull them. Richard spoke from the floor where he'd sat down, his back against the desk, his hands open in his lap. There's something else. He said it the way you say things when you've passed the event horizon of the conversation and there's nothing left to protect. Stahl knows about the photograph, the one in the closet. He looked at Alexander. He knows what it means. He knows she kept it, which means he knows you've seen it by now. He paused. He left it there intentionally, 8 months ago. He replaced the original with a copy. A beat. The original photograph is proof of her identity, forensic-level proof. Location tagged, time-stamped. Stahl has it. Alexander felt the floor of the situation shift under him. The sickening reorientation of someone who realizes the thing they've been standing on was never what they thought it was. Stahl didn't just have the organization's financial architecture. He didn't just have Messina's name and number. He had provable documentation that Alexander Whitmore's wife was the Black Lily, an assassin connected to over a dozen federal investigations, whose activities would expose Alexander to a level of law enforcement scrutiny that would end his operation, his freedom, and his life in its current form more completely than any rival crime family had ever come close to doing. Stahl had a weapon that didn't need a trigger. He had leverage, which meant tonight was never about the warehouse. The warehouse was a place to put Alexander while the real move happened elsewhere. The real move was already done, had been done for months, sitting in a safe somewhere, waiting to be used the moment Stahl decided the time was right. And what had happened tonight, their escape from the building, their arrival here, the calls Vivian had made, had given Stahl exactly the confirmation he needed that she was active, that her network was real, and that it was time to stop waiting. Vivian stood in the center of the warehouse office with a dead phone in her hand and the full weight of what had just been laid out settling onto her, and Alexander watched her face and saw something he had never expected to see on it. Not defeat, not fear. The specific expression of a person who has been playing a game they thought they understood, who has just discovered the game was larger than the board they could see, and who is in the process, right now, in real time, in the space of a warehouse office in Red Hook at 2 a.m, of deciding whether the person they chose to become 11 years ago is the person they can afford to remain. She turned to Alexander. Her face was open in a way it almost never was. The composed surface stripped down to what lived under it, which was something rawer and less finished and more real than anything he had ever seen her show. "I need to tell you something," she said, "about Stahl." He waited. "I know who he is," she said, "not from your organization, not from anything I found in the last 8 months. She paused. "I know him because I was hired to kill him 12 years ago. The job I took before the accident. The mission I told you I completed." She stopped. "I didn't complete it." The warehouse office was very quiet. "Stahl," she said, "is the man who took my sight." The warehouse held the silence for 3 full seconds after she said it. Then Richard Blackwood said very quietly, "Oh, Christ," and put his face in his hands. Alexander didn't move. He was standing 4 feet from his wife, and he was looking at her face and doing the kind of arithmetic that doesn't involve numbers. The kind where you take everything you know and reconfigure it around a single new fact and watch the entire landscape reorganize into something you don't recognize. 12 years. The accident that wasn't an accident. The man who had taken her sight and whom she had told him she'd never identified. All of it reshaping now around the name Warren Stahl with a precision that felt like a door closing. "He knew who you were before tonight," Alexander said. "Before 8 months ago." "Yes. He's known for 12 years. He knew who I was when he blinded me. He let me live because he thought the blindness was enough. He thought it would end me." Her voice was completely flat, not emotionless. The flatness was the emotion, the specific texture of a feeling that has been compressed for so long it has changed state. He was wrong, But he didn't know that until recently. What changed recently? I don't know yet. She turned her face slightly away from him, that listening orientation. But he waited 12 years to move, and he moved 8 months ago, which means something changed, something he learned, or something I did, or something that shifted the calculation for him. She paused. I've been trying to identify it. I haven't. Eddie Tran made a sound from the chair, a low, involuntary sound. The sound of a body in pain doing its maintenance work, whether or not the mind wanted to acknowledge it. Alexander looked at him. The injection site on his left arm was visibly inflamed now, the skin around it raised and discolored. What did you give him? He said to Richard. Richard lifted his face from his hands. He looked 10 years older than he had that morning in the conference room. Phenylephrine, to keep his blood pressure up. He stopped. He was going to tell me where Vivian kept her external accounts, her independent ledger. I needed him conscious. How much? Too much. Richard said it without inflection, the tone of a man past the point of managing his own presentation. He needs a hospital. Alexander looked at Messina's 2 people, the woman with the scar and her partner, who had stationed themselves on opposite sides of the room without being told. Take him out, he said. North face, access road. There's a car. Get him to Mercy General, not the nearest ER. Mercy General has a doctor on the 2nd floor who doesn't report. Dr. Okafor, tell him it's a Whitmore matter. The woman moved without question. Her partner unclipped the zip ties from the chair with practiced efficiency and got Eddie Tran upright with the careful, specific strength of someone who'd done emergency carries before. Eddie groaned and then went quiet, his head lolling, his body willing but uncoordinated. They moved him toward the door. The roof access, Vivian said. Not loudly. The woman stopped. When you go out, there are 2 additional people outside this building who weren't there when you arrived. They came in the last 20 minutes from the east. Don't use the north face. The woman looked at her, then at Alexander. Alexander nodded once. She rewrote it without comment, taking Eddie through the interior toward the west service door, and they were gone. The office had Richard, Alexander, and Vivian, and whatever the next minutes were going to require of all 3 of them. Get up, Alexander said to Richard. Richard got up. He moved carefully, the way men move when they're not sure what the room has decided about them yet. He was 51 years old, and he looked it in a way he usually didn't. The overhead light in the office was unforgiving, the kind that found every line in a face and committed to it. He stood with his hands at his sides and met Alexander's eyes and didn't look away, which Alexander noted and filed. Stahl's location, Alexander said. Right now. I don't know his permanent location. Where does he operate from when he's running an active play in New York? Richard's jaw worked. There's a building in Tribeca, a commercial property. Looks like a private equity firm. 8th floor is his when he's in the city. He paused. But Alex, listen to me. If you go there tonight, if you go there after everything that's happened in this building tonight, he'll know you're coming before you're through the door. He has surveillance on everything. He has people everywhere. That's how he... Does he have people in this building right now? Vivian said. Richard stopped. The 2 on the east side, she said. The ones who've been outside since we arrived. Who sent them? Richard's silence lasted exactly 1 second too long. Richard, Alexander's voice dropped to the register it went to when he was done with the preliminary stage of a conversation. The register that people who'd worked for him knew meant that the next thing he said would not be a question. Stahl sent them, Richard said. He sent them before you got here. He knew you were coming to this location. How? Because I told him. Richard held eye contact, not defiantly, without the energy for defiance, which was different. When you didn't show at the garage, I called him. I told him you'd gone off script, and I thought you were coming here. He sent 2 people to observe. To observe. To observe and report, not to engage. Richard looked between them. He doesn't want you dead, Alex. I told you that. He wants the leverage. He wants her network, and the photograph is his insurance. He uses it, or he doesn't, depending on whether she cooperates. Cooperates, Vivian said. He wants a meeting. That's what this whole operation was, y'all. Not a takedown, a setup for a forced meeting where he holds all the cards. Richard looked at her. He wants to offer you terms. The words sat in the office air, and neither Alexander nor Vivian said anything for a moment. What terms? She said finally. Her network in exchange for the photograph. She hands over the contacts, the account architecture, the methods, everything she built independently, and he destroys the documentation and walks away from the Whitmore organization. Richard paused. He told me if she agreed, the organization stays intact. Nothing changes for Alex. Nobody goes to federal authorities. Everybody keeps what they have. He paused again. He said to tell her he has always respected her work, that this isn't personal. Vivian made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. It was too short and too cold for a laugh. It was the sound of someone hearing an absurdity that's too large for any other response. He blinded me, she said. I know. And he wants to offer me terms. I'm telling you what he said. She turned away from Richard entirely. She turned toward Alexander, and her face was doing something he had never seen it do. Not the controlled surface, not the unreadable depth, but something that moved between them in real time, that was happening in the present tense, without the usual architecture of management around it. She was furious. Not the hot furious that burns itself out, but the cold, structural kind that reorganizes itself into purpose. The two people outside, she said, they're observers, according to Richard, which means they have a communication line to Stahl. She tilted her head slightly. He knows we're still in this building. He's been waiting for Richard to produce the meeting. She paused. He's going to wait another 10 minutes before he decides the meeting isn't happening and escalates. How do you know 10 minutes? Because that's how long it would take me. She turned back toward the room with the efficiency of someone who has finished processing and moved into implementation. Alexander, your arm. He had almost stopped noticing the arm. The hit had gone through the outer edge of the left tricep, a graze deep enough to bleed seriously, not deep enough to compromise the muscle in the short term. He'd packed it with the lining of his jacket pocket, a field-grade solution he'd learned to perform without thinking about 20 years ago. It was soaked through now. It's manageable, he said. For how long? Long enough. She crossed the room to him and reached up and put her hand against his arm with a precision that meant she wasn't searching. She knew exactly where the wound was, had known since the main floor, had been tracking it by the way he was holding his left side. She pressed against it with a controlled pressure that made his jaw tighten and replaced the improvised packing with a strip of material she'd produced from somewhere on her person, wrapped it with the focused speed of someone who had done this for people who were not in the position to wait. Richard is going to walk out through the south door and meet the two observers, she said while she worked. He's going to tell them the meeting is arranged, that we've agreed to terms, that Stahl should come here. Alexander looked at Richard. Richard looked at Vivian's hands on Alexander's arm. His face had the specific, particular expression of a man sitting at the intersection of what he'd done and what he was being asked to do about it, and finding that intersection considerably smaller and more uncomfortable than he'd imagined when he made his original choices. He won't come here, Richard said. Stahl never comes to a location he doesn't control. He'll come if he believes she's ready to hand over the network, Vivian said. She tied off the wrapping without looking at it. He's waited 12 years for this. Whatever it was that changed 8 months ago, whatever made him move, it made him need this quickly. He's not patient anymore. Something has shifted in his situation, and he's on a timeline. She stepped back from Alexander. He'll come. And if he doesn't, Richard said, then we go to him. She said it simply. But he'll come, because the one thing Warren Stahl cannot stand, the one thing that has always driven his operational decisions, is the possibility that something he wants is about to stop being available. Richard stared at her. You know him. I spent 8 months studying a target before every assignment. I know everything about how he thinks. A pause. I also know that his particular psychology does not tolerate the idea of a negotiation happening without him present. He'll send people if he thinks there's a clean takedown available. He comes personally when he believes there's something to gain. Her voice was level. Tell his observers that she's agreed to the meeting, but she'll only hand the network to Stahl directly, that she won't transfer it through intermediaries. Richard looked at Alexander. Alexander said nothing. He was looking at his wife. Do it, Alexander said. Richard left through the south door. The office was very quiet. Vivienne moved to the desk and sat on the edge of it. Not in the chair, on the edge, her posture, the particular upright readiness of someone whose body doesn't go fully off duty. Alexander stood with his back to the wall and his right hand near his weapon and his left arm throbbing in the specific, insistent way that wounds throb when adrenaline starts to drop. "You're not going to hand him anything," Alexander said. "No." "So what happens when he gets here and realizes that?" "He'll try to take it by force." She was quiet for a moment. "Which is what I want him to do." He waited. Stahl operates on leverage. The photograph, the documentation, the financial architecture, all of it is leverage. Instruments of control. He doesn't use force directly if he can avoid it, because force is unpredictable, and Stahl has spent his entire career building systems that eliminate unpredictability. She paused. "But if he believes the leverage is about to stop working, if he believes I'm going to destroy the network before he can access it, or that the photograph can be neutralized, he stops being the man with the instruments of control and becomes something else." "What does he become?" "Desperate." She said it quietly. "And desperate men make mistakes I can work with." Alexander studied her face. "You're going to make him believe the photograph can be neutralized." "I'm going to tell him the truth," she said, "which is that the photograph he has is documentation of where I was and what I was doing on a specific date 12 years ago. And that if that documentation becomes public, it exposes not just me, but every client I worked for during that period. And that several of those clients are currently in positions, political, financial, institutional, that make the exposure of their connection to the Black Lily considerably more damaging to them than it is to me." She paused. "Stahl's business model depends on those people. He has worked for them. He has been paid by them. The photograph doesn't just leverage me, it leverages his entire client base." Another pause. "He knows this. He's always known this. It's why he's offered terms instead of simply using it. So it's mutually assured destruction. It's leverage that cuts both ways, which makes it not leverage at all." She turned her face toward the window. "He needs me to willingly hand over the network. He can't take it by force because he doesn't know what he doesn't know. He knows the network exists, he knows I've maintained it, but he doesn't know its full structure. If he moves against me and I shut it down before he can map it, he ends up with nothing but a photograph he can't use without destroying himself." She paused. "That's the position I need him to fully understand before anything else happens tonight." Alexander processed this. The operational clarity of it. The years it must have taken to think through. Not just tonight, but the whole architecture of the position, the way she'd built it over 11 years as a contingency she hoped she'd never need. The quiet, parallel intelligence of a woman who had been preparing for this conversation, in one form or another, since the night in an unnamed location 12 years ago when a man named Warren Stahl had decided that blinding her was enough. "When he arrives," Alexander said, "you're going to be in this room." "Yes." "He's going to have people with him." "At least 4, probably 6. She paused. "His personal protection is a man named Greer, former military, Eastern European contract work after that. He'll be closest." Another pause. "Greer is right-handed, and he has a plate in his left shoulder from an injury in 2019. He favors his right side in close quarters." "How do you know that?" "Because I found out 3 months ago when I started building the file on Stahl. I didn't know why I was building it yet." She said it without drama. "I think part of me knew." The next 20 minutes were preparation. The specific, methodical kind that has no room for the emotional material underneath it, that requires the subordination of everything except the immediate tactical problem. Alexander moved through the warehouse with the woman from Messina's network. She had come back from getting Eddie to the car, coming in through the west service door without being asked, which meant she'd been told to stay close. He walked the space with her, identifying positions, angles, the specific geography of an encounter he was designing in real time under conditions he hadn't chosen. His arm hurt with a constancy that he worked around the way you work around a sound that won't stop, not ignoring it, just locating it and accounting for it and building the next action around its existence rather than its absence. At 11:47, Richard came back through the south door. His face was a careful blank. "He's coming," Richard said. 20 minutes. He's bringing 5 people. He told me to tell you—" He stopped. "What?" Vivian said. "He told me to tell you he's glad you were reasonable." Richard looked at her directly. "He said he always hoped it would go this way." She said nothing. "He also said—" Richard hesitated. "He said to tell you that he was sorry about what happened in Munich, that it was a business decision, not a personal one." Munich. Alexander filed the name without asking. There was a version of the next hour that survived and a version that didn't. And if they survived it, there would be time for Munich and everything else. If they didn't survive it, it wouldn't matter. Vivian's expression didn't change. "Tell me where you want me," Richard said. She turned toward him. The look she gave him, oriented toward him, reading him by the particular quality of his presence in the room, was long and uncompromising. "I want you visible when he arrives. In this room, standing where he can see you. He needs to believe you're still his." She paused. "Can you do that?" "Yes. If you run or signal, I'm not going to run." Richard said it flatly. "I'm done running. I've been running for 18 months and I'm done." He looked at Alexander. "For whatever it's worth." Alexander looked at the man who had been his closest lieutenant for 9 years. The man who had sat at his table and driven his car, and stood at his wedding and spent 18 months selling him to a man named Warren Stahl for reasons Alexander had not yet asked and might never fully understand. He looked at him the way you look at a wound you've been ignoring, with the full attention it deserved, finally, too late. "It's not worth much," Alexander said, "but it's something." Richard nodded once. That was all. At 12:04, the sound of vehicles on the access road, 2, by the engine noise, stopping at the south side. Alexander was positioned in the interior, in the shadow behind a structural column 20 feet from the office door. Vivian was in the office, seated, the edge of the desk behind her, her hands in her lap. She had asked him to stay outside the office until she called him in, and he had agreed to it with the specific, effortful trust of a man who has decided what kind of partner he's going to be and is in the immediate process of finding out what that costs. He could hear her breathing from where he stood. Slow, even. The physiological discipline of someone who trained their nervous system the way other people trained their bodies. The south door opened. 5 people entered. Alexander cataloged them in the 6 seconds of movement before they reached the office. The specific physical grammar of each one, the weight distribution, the angle of entry, the position of hands. The one in front right was Greer by the right side favor Vivian had described. A large man with a Marine's posture and civilian clothes that didn't entirely contain it. Behind them, Warren Stahl walked into the Red Hook warehouse like a man walking into a room he'd already furnished. He was 63. Medium height. The kind of physical presence that operated not through size but through the specific certainty of a man who had never walked into a room he wasn't confident he could control. Silver-haired, lean, the face of someone who had spent decades in the kind of work that compresses a person into their most essential qualities and discards the rest. He was wearing a dark coat, and he moved with an ease that was either arrogance or confidence, and from where Alexander stood it was impossible to tell the difference. He went to the office door, looked at Richard, looked at Vivian. He didn't look around the warehouse interior, didn't check the shadows. He had people for that, and the absence of threat signals from those people told him the space was clear, and he trusted his people's assessment, and that was the first mistake, and he didn't know it yet. "Vivian," he said. His voice was medium-low, unaccented American, the voice of a man who had gone to schools that trained voices the same way they trained everything else. "I'm glad you decided to be sensible about this." She said nothing. He came into the office. Greer followed, staying near the door. One additional person came in. The other 3 held the main floor. Stahl looked at Richard. "Thank you, Richard. You can wait outside." Richard looked at Vivian. A fraction of a second. She gave nothing. He moved toward the door. "Stay," Vivian said. Stahl looked at her. The ease didn't change. A man reassessing a room's configuration without letting the reassessment reach his face. "Richard's part in this is finished." "He stays," she said. "I want a witness." "You don't need a witness for a business arrangement." "I need a witness," she said, Because I want someone to hear exactly what I'm about to tell you, and I want that person to be someone who's been in the middle of this long enough to understand all of it. She paused. Richard stays, or I don't talk. Stahl looked at Richard, nodded fractionally. Richard stayed. Stahl came further into the room and took the chair across from the desk, took it with the proprietorial ease of a man who sat down in chairs rather than waiting to be offered them. He looked at Vivian with an attention that was professional and completely unashamed. Assessing, cataloging, the way he'd been looking at her, Alexander thought, in one way or another, for 12 years. The photograph? Vivian said. The documentation you've been holding. Safe and authenticated, Stahl said. 3 independent copies, 3 separate locations, all with instructions for release in the event of my death or incapacitation. He said it without emphasis, a recitation of terms. I know, she paused. You had it made in 2015. The locations are a deposit box at a private bank in Zurich under the name Hargreaves, a law firm in Singapore that doesn't know what they're holding, and a digital archive managed by a former associate of yours named Pulkkinen, who retired to Estonia in 2018. She paused again. Pulkkinen died 4 months ago, cardiac arrest apparently. Her voice was completely level. The digital archive transferred automatically to a secondary contact upon his death. The secondary contact is someone I've known since 2009. The ease left Stahl's face. It didn't disappear entirely. Men like Stahl didn't let things disappear entirely. But it shifted, recalibrated, and the thing underneath it was visible for the first time. The Zurich box was accessed 6 weeks ago, Vivian continued. Not by you. By someone using credentials that matched yours closely enough to pass the bank's verification, but weren't yours. The documents inside were replaced with accurate copies with one modification, a metadata signature that will flag them as fabricated under any forensic examination conducted after January of this year. She paused. The Singapore firm received a legal notice 3 weeks ago regarding the chain of custody of sealed documents held under your account. They've placed the contents in disputed status pending review. She paused one final time. The original photograph, the one you took from my closet 8 months ago and replaced with a copy, is in my possession. Has been for 6 weeks. The office was absolutely still. Stahl sat in the chair and looked at her, and his face was doing something that Alexander, watching from the dark of the warehouse beyond the doorway, had never seen on a face like his. Not panic, not yet. Something that preceded panic, but the moment of genuine recalibration when a man realizes the map he's been navigating from is not the map of the territory he's in. You've had 6 weeks, Stahl said. His voice was controlled, barely. You've had 6 weeks and you didn't use any of it. I was waiting, she said. For what? For you to come to me. His jaw tightened, the slight shift in weight that meant what it meant on any body. The body preparing for something the mind hadn't decided on yet. Greer in the doorway had registered the shift and was registering Stahl's changed demeanor and was in the process of a threat assessment that was going to conclude in the next 20 seconds. Alexander's hand was on his weapon. The network, Stahl said. His voice had changed, stripped of the ease, down to something harder and less managed. You think removing the documentation changes anything about the network? I still know it exists. I still have the capacity. You have the capacity to do what? Her voice was quiet. To threaten me with a photograph that no longer exists in any form you control? To leverage clients of yours whose connection to my work is now more dangerous for them, and through them for you, than it ever was for me? She paused. Or to do what you're thinking about doing right now? Greer moved. He moved fast, faster than his size suggested, and he moved toward Vivian, which was the decision Stahl had made with the shift in weight and the change in his face, the decision that Alexander had been waiting for from the moment Stahl sat down in that chair, because it was the decision Vivian had said Stahl would make when he ran out of leverage and became desperate, and desperate men made the mistakes she could work with. Alexander came through the doorway. Greer was 6 feet from Vivian when Alexander hit him from the right side with everything the right arm had, which was everything because the right arm was the one that worked. The impact drove Greer sideways into the doorframe with a sound that was unambiguous about what had happened to at least two of his ribs. He was large and he was trained, and those facts absorbed about 40% of it, and the rest landed and he made a sound and stayed upright, which was better than Alexander had hoped for and worse than he needed. The second person in the office brought a weapon up. Vivian was not in the chair. She was behind him. Not behind him by accident, but behind him. Because the moment Greer moved, she had moved, had come off the desk edge with the front-weighted physicality he'd watched in the warehouse hallway, and had not stopped moving. And the specific way she dealt with the weapon and the person holding it was something Alexander saw in his peripheral vision while managing Greer and filed in the category of things he would think about later. From the main floor, the sound of the three exterior people registering that something had changed and moving toward the office. Greer hit Alexander's left arm deliberately, found the wound by observation or by luck, pressed into it with a thumb with the specific targeted brutality of someone who knew what he was doing. And Alexander's vision went white at the edges, and he made a sound he didn't intend and went to one knee. Greer's elbow came down. Alexander took it on the shoulder instead of the skull by moving, which was an automatic response rather than a decision, and it put him lower but not out, and from one knee he drove upward with everything in his legs into Greer's center mass, and they went into the desk together, and the desk moved, and something on it fell and shattered, and Greer's head connected with the wall behind it with a sound that changed the situation. The three people from the main floor were in the doorway. Richard Blackwood hit the first one from behind with the steel chair that had been Eddie Tran's for the past however many hours, with a force that said he'd decided something and was done deliberating. And the first one went down, and the other two had to reroute, and those 2 seconds were the 2 seconds that mattered. Vivian was at stall, not armed. She hadn't drawn a weapon because in the specific geometry of the room, and the moment a weapon was less useful than hands, which were precise in ways weapons in close quarters were not. She had his right arm immobilized in a way that demonstrated a detailed knowledge of what the shoulder joint could and could not sustain, and she had him against the wall, and she was 3 inches from his face when Alexander got back on his feet. Stahl was breathing hard, not just from the physical, from the specific deep breathing of a man who is in a situation his entire life has trained him to not be in, a man who controls things, who structures things, who has spent 63 years ensuring that he is never in a room where someone else has the deciding position. He was in that room now. The network, Vivian said. Her voice had not changed, not 1 degree. Is not something you'll ever have access to. The photograph is gone. The documentation is gone. Everything you built the last 8 months on is gone. She paused. And the only thing left in this room is you, and the question of what you're willing to do about it. Stahl looked at her. His face, this close, was the face of a man who has finally fully understood something he'd been avoiding. Munich, he said. It came out differently than his other words. Lower. More compressed, like a word he'd been carrying for a long time. I should have... Don't, she said. Don't. He went quiet. From the main floor, the sounds of the situation resolving. Richard, and whatever capacity he had left, Messina's person who had come back in through the west door at some point, the specific ambient audio of a space where the balance of force has shifted, and the people on the wrong side of the shift know it. Alexander stood 6 feet away and looked at Warren Stahl, at the man who had taken his wife's sight 12 years ago and spent the years since building an architecture of leverage designed to finally completely neutralize what he'd failed to destroy the first time, and felt something that wasn't fury and wasn't satisfaction, but was somewhere between them. A cold, clear thing. The specific feeling of a situation arriving at its actual shape after a long time pretending to be something else. What now? Stahl said. To Vivian. Only to Vivian. She held his arm for another 3 seconds, then she released it and stepped back. She didn't move away from him. Just created distance, enough to see his whole body, to read whatever his body decided to do with the next moment. Now, she said, you're going to tell me every person in your client network who has been using your operation as coverage for the last 4 years. Every name, every arrangement, Everything. She paused. Because the documentation I have isn't just the photograph, and the person who has it isn't just me. A pause. And because the alternative to telling me is a phone call I make in the next 10 minutes that makes everything you've spent 30 years building into a problem you will not recover from. Stahl looked at her. His right shoulder was going to be compromised for weeks. His people were down or otherwise occupied. He was in a building he'd chosen because he thought he controlled it, in a meeting he'd called because he thought he held all the positions. He looked like a man doing mathematics, the kind where the answer is always the same no matter how many times you run the calculation, and you keep running it because you can't yet accept that the answer is what it is. All right, he said. He said it quietly, without theater. The way you concede something that cost you everything. Not dramatically, because drama was for people who still had options, and Stahl, for the first time in 30 years, had run out of them. Vivian turned toward Alexander. Her face was open in that new way, the way it had been in the kitchen, stripped of the surface, the thing underneath it visible and present and entirely hers. She was breathing evenly. Her hair had come loose. There was a cut above her left eyebrow that was bleeding with the patient persistence of minor wounds, and she didn't appear to have noticed it, and Alexander thought that if he reached up to touch it, she would let him. "We're not done," she said. "There's still the matter of what Stahl gave to Greco's people, the financial exposure, the shell company documentation that's now in play in Philadelphia." She paused. "We have until morning before someone in Greco's organization realizes Stahl's operation here has failed and decides to move independently." She looked at Alexander directly. "How long can you hold the organization's eastern position without the account architecture Stahl compromised?" He did the arithmetic fast and didn't like the number. 72 hours, maybe. 80. "We have until morning," she said again. "I know." She was still looking at him. The cut above her eyebrow was putting a thin line of blood down toward her cheekbone, and she was standing in a Red Hook warehouse at 12:30 in the morning next to the man she'd spent 12 years waiting to have this conversation with, and Alexander watched her face do something he had never in 11 years of marriage seen it do. She was not okay. She was holding it together with the structural discipline of decades of practice, but underneath the structure, at the level where things were true, she was not okay. The night had cost something she hadn't finished calculating yet, and the calculation was happening in real time behind eyes that couldn't see him. And he stood there watching it happen and felt the specific, unclassifiable feeling of a man who understands, finally and completely, that the person he loves is not someone who needs his protection. She needs something else entirely, something harder than protection, something he wasn't sure he'd ever been asked to give anyone before. She needs someone to still be standing next to her when the structure comes down. "Hey," he said. She turned toward him. "We go together from here," he said. "All of it. No more separate ledgers." She was quiet for a moment, long enough that he thought she was going to qualify it, condition it, build a contingency into it the way she built contingencies into everything. "Okay," she said, and behind her, Warren Stahl sat against the wall with his compromised shoulder and his dismantled operation and his mouth open, ready to give them everything. While outside the Red Hook warehouse, the city moved toward morning carrying all of its weight and noise and indifference, and somewhere in it Greco's people were still in motion, and the account architecture was still exposed, and there were still 72 hours in which everything could come apart. But in this room, in this moment, the balance had shifted in a direction it was not going to shift back from. And Warren Stahl, who had spent 12 years believing he had neutralized the most dangerous woman in the American underworld by taking her sight, sat in the rubble of that belief and understood, too late, the way understanding always arrives when it costs the most, that the Black Lily had never stopped being the Black Lily. She had only been waiting for a reason to let him see it. Stahl talked for 41 minutes. He talked the way men talk when the architecture of their position has been completely dismantled, and the only thing left with any value is the information inside them. Not reluctantly, not with the theater of a man being broken, but with the flat, comprehensive precision of someone who has done a final calculation and arrived at cooperation as the only outcome that kept him breathing past dawn. He gave names, he gave arrangement structures, He gave the 4-year timeline of how he had moved through Alexander's organization using Diane Cho as his primary vector and Richard as his secondary, and he gave the specific mechanism by which Diane Cho had died, which was not cardiac arrest, and involved a compound that left no standard forensic signature, and he gave the name of the man who had administered it. Alexander stood through all of it. His left arm had stopped the sharp pain and moved into the deep, bone-adjacent ache that meant the adrenaline was fully gone, and the wound was doing what wounds did without interference. He stood because sitting felt like something he couldn't afford yet, some signal to his body that the work was done when the work was not done. And he listened to Warren Stahl dismantle 30 years of operational architecture one piece at a time, and he kept his face arranged and his breathing controlled, and he did not look at Vivian because if he looked at Vivian, he was going to stop being able to maintain any of it. She sat on the edge of the desk throughout. The cut above her eyebrow had dried into a thin, dark line. She didn't touch it. She listened to Stahl with her head very slightly tilted and her hands in her lap, and she asked questions when his account created gaps, precise single-sentence questions that opened the gap and waited for it to be filled, and Stahl filled them. Everyone. When he finished, the warehouse office was quiet for a moment in the specific way spaces go quiet after something large has been said. Not peaceful, just emptied. Vivian reached into her jacket and produced a phone. Not the prepaid, her regular phone. She made a call that lasted 45 seconds and consisted almost entirely of a string of names, an address on the Upper West Side, and the words by morning, and then she ended it and put the phone away. "Who was that?" Alexander said. "Someone who will make sure the names go to the right places." She paused. Stahl's client network has been generating federal-level exposure for 3 years. The agency watching it has been waiting for a complete list of principals. They have it now. She looked in Stahl's direction. "He'll be picked up within 4 hours. In federal custody, he's untouchable, and his leverage against your organization dies with his freedom." Stahl said nothing. He had known this was one of the possible outcomes when he'd agreed to talk. He had chosen it over the alternative, which meant he had looked at the alternative and found it worse, which told Alexander something about what the alternative was, and he filed it and didn't ask. "The Greco exposure," Alexander said. "The financial architecture Stahl gave them. The account structures Stahl passed to Greco's people were accurate as of 8 months ago. I've been moving the organization's assets through a secondary architecture for the last 6 weeks." She paused. "The accounts Greco has are empty. Have been for 3 weeks." Another pause. "I was going to tell you." He looked at her. "I was going to tell you," she said again, without apology, but with something more precise than apology. The specific acknowledgement of a person who knows the distinction between a secret kept for self-protection and one kept for someone else's, and knows which one this was. "I needed to finish moving everything before I explained it. If I told you mid-transfer, you would have wanted to be involved, and 2 people moving that volume of assets leaves twice the signature." He absorbed this, the specific quality of swallowing something large in real time. "How much did you move?" "Everything that mattered." Richard Blackwood, who had been sitting on the floor against the north wall since the fight, who had taken a hit from one of Stahl's people that had opened a cut on his cheek, and who had not complained about it or asked for anything, spoke for the first time in 40 minutes. "The Eastern accounts, the ones under the Meridian Holdings umbrella." "Moved," she said. "The construction subsidiary." "Moved." Richard was quiet for a moment. "How long have you been able to do that? Access those accounts?" "Since the 2nd year of our marriage," she said. "Alexander gave me signature authority on the subsidiary accounts in 2015. He thought it was a formality." A pause. "I used it to learn the full architecture. It took 8 months." Richard looked at Alexander. Alexander looked at nothing in particular for a moment, at the middle distance, at the specific territory a person stares at when they're adjusting to a scale of information that keeps revising upward. "Is there anything in this organization you don't know?" he said finally. She considered this with what appeared to be genuine seriousness. "The names of your crew leaders' children," she said. "I never needed them." Richard made a sound that was, under all the other things, almost a laugh. It came out wrong, too compressed, too much in it, but it was there. Alexander didn't laugh. But something in him shifted, some final rigid thing softening in a way he hadn't expected, and he put his hand briefly against the back of her neck, and she leaned into it by exactly the degree she always did, which was small and deliberate and complete. They left the warehouse at 1:47 in the morning. Messina's two people stayed to manage the situation in the building. The people who were down, the logistics of what came next, the specific unglamorous administrative work that always followed violence and never got accounted for in any version of the story anyone chose to tell later. Alexander didn't ask for details because he had done this long enough to know when details were his responsibility and when they belonged to the people he was trusting. Richard came with them. They rode in a car. Alexander drove himself, his right arm only, which made certain turns require more effort than they should have, which he did not comment on. Vivian was in the passenger seat. Richard was in the back, and he sat without speaking for the first 10 minutes. And then he said, "I need to tell you why." Alexander said nothing. "It wasn't money," Richard said. "I know that's what it looks like. Stahl paid me, but that's not—" He stopped, started again. "My son, Marcus. He's 24. 3 years ago, he got himself into something in Boston. Drugs, distribution. Not using, dealing, which is worse in every way that matters legally. Stahl knew about it. He approached me with documentation. He told me if I cooperated, Marcus's exposure would disappear. If I didn't—" He stopped again. His voice had the texture of something that had been kept at pressure for a very long time and was now releasing. "I told myself it was temporary, that I'd find a way out of it that didn't cost Alex everything. I kept telling myself that for 18 months. The car moved through the city. The streets at this hour had the particular quality of a place between states. Not night anymore, not yet morning, the amber light of the street lamps doing its usual incomplete work on the darkness. "Marcus," Alexander said, "is he still in Boston?" "He moved back. He's been clean for a year. He works construction." "Give his full name to Vivian." Alexander kept his eyes on the road. "The Boston exposure will be handled." Richard was quiet for a long moment. "Alex." "Don't." Alexander's voice wasn't hard. It was tired. The specific tiredness that wasn't about sleep. "Don't thank me. Don't apologize again. Just give her the name and let us handle it, and we'll talk about the rest of it when I've decided what there is to say." Richard leaned back. He put his head against the seat and closed his eyes and let out a long breath. And Alexander heard in that breath 18 months of something the man had been carrying alone. And he didn't forgive him. Not yet, not in the clean, simple way that word implied. But he understood him, which was its own kind of beginning. They reached the hospital at 2:20. "Doctor." Okafor was on the second floor, as predicted, and Eddie Tran was stable, which was the word the doctor used with the specific, careful neutrality of a man who had learned to calibrate his language for the people who came to him at these hours. The phenylephrine had been cleared, and the worst of the inflammation was responding to treatment, and he would be uncomfortable for several days and fully functional within the week. Alexander sat in a chair outside the room while Okafor addressed the arm. The process was unpleasant and efficient in the way medical processes performed in non-medical settings always were. Cleaning, suturing, 3 stitches that Alexander counted, not because he needed to, but because counting was something to do while the needle went in. Okafor gave him a look that was entirely professional and said nothing about the hour or the location or the source of the injury, which was why Alexander used him. Vivian was in the corridor when he came out. She had found a bathroom somewhere and dealt with the cut above her eyebrow. It had been closed with 2 of the small adhesive strips that Okafor apparently kept in his office for exactly this category of visitor, and the dried blood had been cleaned from her cheek. She was standing at the corridor window with her hands at her sides and her face turned toward the glass, and the city beyond the glass was beginning very faintly to show the first colorless precursor of morning at the horizon. He sat down in the chair near her. She didn't turn from the window. "Eddie's going to be all right." "Yes." He didn't know what he was walking into when Richard approached him. He thought it was an internal audit. A restructuring Stahl was proposing through Richard as a legitimate business offer. She paused. "He figured out what it was when it was too late to come to you without implicating himself. Is that why Richard had him here tonight?" Richard needed to know how much Eddie had figured out, and who he'd told. Eddie hadn't told anyone. She paused. He was trying to find a way out that didn't end his career or his life. He didn't find one before tonight found him. A breath. He's loyal. Badly positioned, but loyal. Alexander thought about that. About loyalty as a quality with actual content. Not the abstract version, the one that sounded like a value, but the specific daily practice of it, which was harder and more irregular and more costly than the abstract version suggested, and which most people abandoned the moment the cost became real. "What do you want to do about him?" he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Let him recover, then bring him back in. He knows the architecture better than anyone you have left, and he's not going to make this mistake again." A pause. "He's also going to know, going forward, what I am. That changes the power dynamics." "Is that what you want?" "It's what makes sense." She turned from the window slightly. Not toward him, but away from the glass, the infinitesimal degree of turning that meant she was shifting her attention. What makes sense and what I want aren't always the same question. He looked at her profile against the pale, early light coming through the corridor window. The adhesive strips on her eyebrow, the line of her jaw, the particular quality of her stillness, which he had spent 11 years reading as composure and which he now understood to be something more specific. The stillness of a person who had trained themselves to be still, for whom stillness was an achievement rather than a natural state. "What do you want?" he said. She was quiet for long enough that he thought she was going to redirect. Then, "I want to go home." A pause. "I want to sleep. I want to be in a room where I know the dimensions and the sounds and where things are, and I want it to be quiet." She paused one more time. "I want to not have to be anything for a few hours." "Okay," he said. "I also want—" She stopped. "Tell me." "I want you to understand that I'm not going back to that." She meant the life before, the Black Lily, the professional identity she had buried and tonight had, in a specific and limited way, exhumed. He could hear in the texture of her voice that she had been building toward this, that even in the middle of everything else, this was the thing she needed to say before they left the corridor. "I did what I did tonight because there was no other way to do it, not because I wanted to." She turned more fully toward him now. "I'm not that person anymore. I was, and then I chose to stop being her, and the choice is still real, even though tonight complicated it." "I know," he said. "Do you?" "Yes." He meant it with the specific simplicity that only comes from having finished arguing with something. He had spent most of the night doing a revision so large it felt like reconstructive work, and on the other side of it he had arrived here, in this corridor, at this hour, with this understanding, that the woman he had spent 11 years trying to protect had never needed protection. What she had needed was what she had asked for in the warehouse office, in a word that had cost her something to say. A partner. Someone who stayed standing. "Whatever you were, I know who you are." She held this for a moment. He could see it settle into her, the way information settles differently when it's received by someone who has spent a long time uncertain whether to believe it. "I lied to you," she said, "for 11 years. You kept something from me." "It's the same thing." "It's not." He shifted in the chair, turned toward her more fully. "Lying is building a false thing. You didn't build a false thing. You built a real thing and kept a room locked. There's a difference." He paused. "The room's not locked anymore." She pressed her lips together. It was a small movement, barely visible, the kind that contained something that had nowhere else to go. She reached out, found his arm by the slight sound of his sleeve against the chair, and put her hand around his wrist. Not the injured side. The other one. She held it with the specific, undemonstrative firmness of someone who does not make physical expressions of feeling casually, and for whom this one therefore carried the full weight of everything she wasn't going to put into words. He put his other hand over hers. They stayed like that for a while. The corridor was empty. The hospital sounds were distant and ambient, the institutional hum that hospitals maintain, the occasional footstep, the particular quality of a building doing its constant, slow work in the margins of human emergency. Through the window, the horizon was lightening in the way it lightens when it's not yet ready to commit to morning, but has stopped being able to pretend it's still night. Richard found them there 20 minutes later. He He had a paper cup of coffee he'd gotten from somewhere, and his face had the settled look of someone who had made decisions he intended to keep. Stahl was picked up 40 minutes ago, he said. He held the coffee and didn't drink it. Federal, the intake process will take a few hours, but once it starts, he won't be making calls. He paused. Greco's people in the city got word around 3 that the Stahl operation had collapsed. They're pulling back. At least 3 of the 12 left in the last hour. The others will follow by morning. The financial exposure, Alexander said. The accounts Stahl's people had flagged are empty. The ones they didn't know about are intact. Richard looked at Vivian when he said this, acknowledging the source without elaborating. The organization is intact. It's going to need restructuring. Crew leaders who had contact with Stahl's network need to be assessed. The comptroller position needs to be rebuilt from the ground up, and the legal layering needs to be re-architected under a new structure. How long? Alexander said. 6 months, conservatively, a year to be fully stable. Alexander nodded. The arithmetic was right. He had been in the business long enough to know that the difference between an organization that survived a penetration like this and one that didn't was entirely in how cleanly and honestly the damage was assessed afterward. No minimizing. No telling yourself the structure was sound when it wasn't. You found every compromised element and you rebuilt it, or you replaced it, and you did not do the human thing of deciding some things could be left because addressing them was too uncomfortable. He looked at Richard. You'll oversee the assessment. Richard went still. You're keeping me on. I'm using you where you're useful. The assessment requires someone who knows exactly where the compromises ran because they ran through him. He paused. You'll report to Vivian all of it. Everything you find. Richard looked at Vivian. She was turned slightly toward the window, and whatever her face was doing was contained enough that he couldn't read it, but he nodded once. The nod of a man who understands the terms and will take them because they're more than he deserved, and because taking them is the only version of himself he has left to be. There's one more thing, Richard said. He set the untouched coffee down on the floor beside his chair. Stahl's record, the operational file on the Black Lily that he was using as documentation. The authentication chain is broken now. The 3 copies are neutralized. But there are peripheral records. People in the old network who knew the name and would recognize her if it became relevant. He paused. I know 2 of them. There may be others. Vivian spoke without turning from the window. Give me the names. What are you going to do with them? Talk to them. She paused. That's all. I'm going to talk to them. He gave her the names. She committed them to memory without writing them down. They left the hospital as the city was crossing from almost morning into the actual thing. That specific moment when the light stops being an absence of dark and starts being light. When the streets begin their transitional filling, the early workers and delivery trucks, and the people who exist in the margins between night's economy and days. Alexander drove. Vivian sat with her hands in her lap. Richard was in the back again, and this time he didn't speak at all, which was its own form of right calibration. They stopped first at Richard's building in Chelsea. He got out and stood on the sidewalk for a moment before closing the car door, looking in at Alexander with the expression of a man who has more to say and the sense to know this wasn't the time for any of it. I'll have the first assessment report to you within the week, he said. To Vivian, Alexander said. Richard looked at her. To Vivian. He closed the door. They watched him go into the building. Then Alexander drove. The city moved around the car. The morning was doing its usual work. Light on glass, the sound of the first food trucks, a woman walking a dog with the particular focused purposefulness of someone who needed the walk as much as the dog did. Normal things. The dense ordinary texture of 12 million lives running simultaneously, mostly without violence, mostly without the specific accumulated weight of the last 8 hours. Vivian spoke when they were on the FDR, the river beside them catching the early light in the particulate way rivers catch light in cities, broken and reconstituted by movement. The photograph, she said, the original, the one I said was in my possession. He glanced at her. I got it back 6 weeks ago, the way I told Stahl. She paused. I destroyed it 3 weeks ago. Then why? Because Stahl needed to believe I had it. Needed to believe I could use it the same way he'd been using it. She paused. The threat only works if he thinks the threat exists. It's gone. Yes. He processed this. Then there's no documentation. Anywhere. The peripheral records Richard mentioned, those exist, but they're not forensic level, and they're not authenticated, and they're in the hands of people who have their own reasons not to surface them. She turned her face toward the windshield. It's manageable. You've been managing it. I've been managing a lot of things. She said it without edge, simply. The tone of a statement that has finally been allowed to be a statement rather than something maintained behind a carefully calibrated surface. Not anymore, he said. You manage things, and you tell me you're managing them. She was quiet for a moment. That's going to require practice. I know. I've been working alone for a very long time. I know that too. She said nothing for a while. The bridge came and went beneath them, and the city transitioned, and the light was coming in properly now. No longer the provisional early version, but the committed morning kind that found the angles in buildings and made them look like themselves. Munich, he said. She had known he would come back to it. He could tell by the way she held still, not tensing, but becoming more precisely present, the quality of attention she brought to things she had decided to be honest about. The last job, she said. 12 years ago. The target was a man named Vasek, a procurement operator who was moving restricted materials to 3 different clients simultaneously, none of whom knew about the others. One of those clients would have used what he was selling to do a great deal of damage to a great many people. She paused. I was contracted to stop the procurement chain. By who? A government entity, not American. It doesn't matter which one now. The people who contracted me have mostly been replaced or retired, and the entity itself has changed enough in 12 years that the connection is effectively historical. She paused. I completed the contract. Vasek was stopped. But Stahl was one of the 3 clients, and he had people watching the procurement site, and when Vasek's operation ended, he sent someone to deal with whoever had ended it. He sent someone to Munich. Yes. The person he sent didn't kill me. A pause. I think the instruction was to kill me. I think the person chose not to, for reasons I've never been able to verify. She paused. But he did what Stahl sent him to do in terms of ending my operational capacity. He knew exactly what to do and exactly how to do it in a way that told me later it was a professional choice, not an accident. She touched the edge of the adhesive strip on her eyebrow, an absent gesture. When I woke up in the hospital, I couldn't see. For the first few days, I thought it was temporary. The doctors were careful with how they said it. He didn't speak. He kept his eyes on the road, and he let her continue at whatever pace the next part required. I spent 6 months in a clinic in Switzerland, learning everything I'd have to relearn, everything that had to be restructured. She paused. And somewhere in those 6 months, I made a decision. I decided that if I was going to survive the next part of my life, not operationally, not professionally, just in terms of being a person who could get through a day, I had to stop being the black lily. Not because I was afraid of her, because I was tired of her. A breath. She was very good at her work, and she was very lonely, and I didn't want to be her anymore. The car moved. The city moved around the car. I took my mother's name, she said. I moved to New York because it was large enough that a careful person could be invisible in it. And I spent 2 years being invisible and learning the city by foot, by sound, by texture, until I knew it well enough that the blindness was not irrelevant, but not the dominant fact. She paused. And then I met you. At the benefit at the Carlisle. You were the only person in the room who talked to me without performing anything. You were just direct. You said what you meant, and you listened when I talked, and you didn't do the thing people do where they overcompensate for the blindness by being aggressively normal about it. She paused. You were just normal about it, naturally. He remembered that night. He had a specific memory of it, the particular quality of the evening, a fundraiser for a hospital building project, the kind of event he attended because certain relationships required it. He remembered her at the edge of the room, not performing the social thing, just present. He had crossed the room because she was the only person there who looked like they might actually be thinking about something. I fell in love with you before I'd worked out what to do about what I was, she said, and then it was too late to introduce the information without losing what we'd built. Or that's what I told myself. A pause. I know that's not entirely honest. The honest version is that I was afraid. I hadn't been afraid of much in my life before that, and I was afraid of that. Of losing it. Of losing you, specifically, yes. The building came into view ahead. Whitmore Tower, the upper floors catching the light. His building, their building. The building that had, as of some hours ago, had men in the lobby paid to watch it, which was going to need to be addressed in practical terms today, this morning, before anything else. But not yet. He found the parking structure on the building's west side and brought the car down into it and pulled into his space and killed the engine. The structure was quiet and orange-lit and smelled of exhaust and concrete, the familiar subterranean smell of it. He sat for a moment with his hands on the wheel. Then he turned toward her. She was already turned toward him, oriented toward him, the precise attentiveness she always brought. The cut above her eyebrow, the dark circles the night had put under her eyes, the particular exhaustion that lived in her face and the specific texture of someone who has held something heavy for a very long time and has finally, partially, set it down. What you were afraid of losing, he said. You didn't lose it. She held still. I mean that, he said. I need you to hear it as a fact, not as something I'm offering because this is the right moment for it. He paused. You kept things from me. You operated inside this marriage with a parallel architecture I didn't know about. And there are going to be months of working out what that means and how we go forward, and neither of those things is going to be simple. He paused. But none of that changes the fact that I love you, and none of it changes what you are to me. Those aren't separate questions. She took a breath. Let it out. It was the kind of breath that carries something out of the body that has been living there under pressure for a long time. The release of a tension held so long it had started to feel structural. Okay, she said. Just that. The same word she'd used in the warehouse office. He understood now what it cost her to say it without qualification. They went upstairs. The penthouse was exactly as they'd left it. The coffee mug still on the kitchen counter with the handle at the angle she'd placed it, the study door slightly open, the morning light beginning to come through the east windows and find the things in the rooms it found every morning. Normal things in normal positions. A home that had not known, while they were gone, what was happening to the people who lived in it. Alexander stood in the kitchen for a moment. He opened the refrigerator and found leftover coffee from the previous morning and put it in the microwave because the previous morning felt very far away and the distance required something practical to mark it. While it heated, he stood at the counter and looked at the room. Vivian had gone to the window, the one in the living room, the big east-facing one that caught the morning full. She stood in front of it with her hands at her sides and her face turned toward the glass, and the light fell on her the way light falls on a person who is standing still enough to let it. She was not seeing the view. She was feeling the warmth of it, the specific quality of early sun through glass, which she had told him once was one of the things she missed the most from before. Not sight itself, but the particular sensory signature of morning light, which she said had a warmth that was different from any other warmth, and which she had spent years relearning to receive without the visual component. He brought the coffee to the living room and set it on the table near her. She turned toward the sound of him and found the cup without difficulty, and picked it up and held it in both hands. She took a sip, made a small sound that was just the fact of coffee after a night like the one they'd had. He sat on the couch. She stayed at the window. "The names Richard gave me," she said. "The peripheral records people. I'll reach out this week." "Not alone." A pause. "No, not alone." The organization assessment. I want to be briefed on it as it progresses. Not just the reports, the process. All right. And Eddie Tran's return to the organization goes through both of us. Agreed. He looked at her at the window, the light on her face, the hands around the coffee cup, the cut healing above her eyebrow, the hair that had been pulled back and had come loose during the night, and now fell in the imprecise way of hair that has been through things, all of it familiar and newly complicated and his. "There's one thing I need to ask you," he said, "and I need the full answer." She waited. The accident in Munich, the person Stahl sent, The one who chose not to kill you. He paused. Do you know who it was? She was quiet for a long moment. The sun moved a fractional degree through the window, and the quality of the light on her face shifted by the same degree. Yes, she said. Is it relevant to anything still in motion? Another pause. No. Then I don't need the name right now. He paused. But I'll need it eventually. I know. She turned slightly from the window. I'll tell you, when I'm ready to tell it the right way. She paused. I've been carrying some of these things for a very long time, Alexander. The putting down process isn't instant. I know. You're going to have to be patient with me. I've been patient with you for 11 years. Something crossed her face. Not quite a smile, something more tentative than a smile, something that hadn't fully decided what it was yet. You were patient with a version of me. I'm patient with all of them. She turned back to the window. The light kept coming in. Somewhere below on the street, the city was doing what the city always did. Filling in, speeding up, the whole dense mechanism of it turning over into the day's business. Somewhere in a federal intake facility, Warren Stahl was being processed through a system that was going to take the rest of his life from him, one procedural step at a time. Somewhere in Chelsea, Richard Blackwood was sitting in his apartment with the weight of 18 months and a son named Marcus, and the particular texture of a man at the beginning of a different kind of accounting. Somewhere in Mercy General, Eddie Tran was sleeping off the thing that had happened to him, and would wake up to a situation that had changed in ways he didn't yet know. And in the penthouse on the 42nd floor, Alexander Whitmore sat on the couch and watched his wife stand in the morning light and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has passed through something irrevocable and emerged on the other side still standing, that the life they were going to build from here was going to be built on an entirely different foundation than the one they'd been living on. Not worse, not easier, just true, which was the thing it hadn't entirely been before, and which was the only thing, he understood now, worth building anything on. He closed his eyes. The light came in through his eyelids in the warm, amber way of morning light. His arm ached. He was going to need 4 hours of sleep before he could be useful to anyone. His organization was going to require months of careful reconstruction. There were names to deal with and records to neutralize and crew leaders to assess and a controller position to rebuild from zero. All of that was true. All of it was waiting. But right now the room was quiet and his wife was at the window and the coffee was warm and the morning had arrived the way mornings arrive even after the worst nights, indifferently, completely, without acknowledgement of what the dark had cost. Come sit down, he said. She turned from the window. She found the couch by the sound of him, by the familiar geography of the room she had memorized a decade ago, and she sat beside him. Close enough that her shoulder was against his arm. She still had the coffee cup in both hands. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He sat with that, the weight of her head, the familiar smell of her, under the blood in the warehouse and the night, just her, the specific warmth of her that he had fallen asleep next to thousands of times without being able to name it properly. The world, she said quietly, to no one in particular, or to him, or to the morning coming through the glass, is going to take a very long time to catch up to what happened last night. Let it, he said. She was quiet. We're still here, he said. She took a slow breath, let it out. In the specific silence that followed, the city below continued its indifferent business, and the light continued to come in, and the room held the two of them with the unheroic faithfulness of rooms that have held people through the things that cannot be undone. Sitting together in the ordinary morning after, which was not triumph and was not resolution in the clean story sense, but was something more durable than either. It was simply this: two people, still. Whatever came next would come. They would meet it the way they had met the night. Not perfectly, not without cost, not without the specific ongoing difficulty of two human beings who carried damage and history and the particular complications of the lives they had chosen. But together. That was the word that had changed. That was the foundation they were on now, stripped of everything that had been built on the old one. Simple, weight-bearing, true. The sun moved through the window. The coffee cooled. Neither of them moved to do anything about either of these facts. Outside, New York continued to be New York, loud, indifferent, completely unaware that anything had resolved in the night among the people who moved through it. The Black Lily had come out of retirement and gone back in the space of a single night. She had done what she needed to do, and she had chosen, again, what she had first chosen 12 years ago in a Swiss clinic when she was learning to read the dimensions of rooms by the sound of her own footsteps, to be something other than the thing the world had trained her to be. The choice didn't get easier with repetition, but it got more certain, and certainty in the long run was worth more than ease. Vivian closed her eyes. Her breathing slowed toward the long rhythm of someone moving toward sleep in the reluctant, incremental way of people too tired to resist it. Alexander sat with his eyes open for a while longer, watching the morning establish itself in the room, doing the last of the night's accounting in the quiet way that required no words and no witness. Then he closed his eyes, too. And the room held them, and the light came in, and the city went on without them for a few hours, which was all they needed.